The small island of Iwo Jima lay in the Pacific, seemingly insignificant to the casual observer. But in the context of the Second World War, this black sand island would become a battleground of incredible importance. For Japan, it was a critical link in their chain of defensive fortifications, a symbol of their unwavering resolve to hold on to their empire. For the United States, it was a stepping stone, an obstacle to the final confrontation with Japan that would bring the war to a close. Iwo Jima's strategic position was undeniable. Located roughly 650 miles south of Tokyo, it sat directly in the path of any American attempt to attack the Japanese home islands. In the early days of 1945, as the Pacific War raged on, Iwo Jima became a focal point in the Allied strategy to end the war. The Japanese military knew its value, and the island's defenses were fortified to the breaking point. From the air, the island appeared small and unassuming, just a dot in the vast ocean. But beneath the surface, it was a land teeming with military installations, bunkers, tunnels, and hidden artillery positions designed to hold off any attack. The island had been transformed into a fortress, a last bastion in Japan's defense strategy. Iwo Jima was not just an island. It was a symbol of Japan's commitment to defend the Pacific at all costs. It had no real strategic value other than its proximity to the Japanese home islands, but for Japan's high command, it was a critical outpost in their defense perimeter. If the island could be held, it would provide the Japanese with a forward base to launch attacks against American bombers, and it would also serve as an important staging area for the defense of the rest of Japan. For the United States, the island's capture was essential to the success of the Pacific offensive. Iwo Jima's airfields were crucial to the success of bombing raids on the Japanese mainland. As the B-29 superfortresses took to the skies, flying long-range missions to Japan, Iwo Jima was to serve as a refueling station, enabling the bombers to strike deeper into enemy territory. It was a vital piece in the Allied puzzle, and its capture was seen as necessary for the final stages of the war. But Iwo Jima was no ordinary island. The Japanese High Command, led by General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, had taken great care in preparing the island for an American invasion. There would be no quick surrender here. The island was fortified with over 16 miles of tunnel, and its defenders were instructed to fight until the last man, understanding the stakes. It would be a battle of attrition, one in which both sides would face unspeakable horrors, and the outcome was anything but certain. In February 1945, the U.S. Navy began its preparations for the assault on Iwo Jima, launching one of the largest amphibious operations in the history of warfare. The island, with its black sands and jagged cliffs, would soon become the scene of one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. The Americans had superior numbers, superior firepower, and were equipped with a massive naval force, but the Japanese defenders were resolute, prepared to fight with everything they had. As the invasion force prepared for the assault, the atmosphere was charged with ominous anticipation. The lessons of past battles in the Pacific, places like Tarawa and Guadalcanal, weighed heavily on the minds of the Marines who would lead the charge. They had learned that the Japanese would not simply surrender. No, they would fight for every inch of ground, and they would inflict unimaginable casualties before they were driven back. The men who had fought through the island-hopping campaign had grown used to brutal battles, but Iwo Jima would be something different. The black sands would become red, soaked with the blood of those who fought and died there. It would not be an easy conquest, but one that would demand everything from the men involved. The shadows of what lay ahead loomed large, casting an ominous pall over the invasion. Iwo Jima was no ordinary battle, and as the first wave of Marines prepared to land, they knew that they would be up against more than just an army. They would be confronting the heart of the Japanese defense, a place where the very soul of Japan's military might would be tested. The island of Iwo Jima was transformed into a nearly impregnable fortress by the Japanese, under the direction of General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, who had been tasked with defending the island against the anticipated American invasion. Knowing that the island could not be held indefinitely in the face of overwhelming American firepower, Kurabayashi chose to make Iwo Jima a fortified stronghold, prepared to inflict maximum casualties on the invaders. The island's black sands and rugged terrain would become the backdrop for one of the most ferocious and brutal battles of World War II. The defensive positions on Iwo Jima were designed to make the battle for the island as difficult and deadly as possible. In total, the Japanese had constructed over 1,500 fortified positions that stretched across the island, including an extensive network of bunkers, tunnels, and artillery emplacements. These were positioned to give the Japanese defenders an advantage, allowing them to fight from underground, emerge at opportune moments to engage the enemy, and then disappear back into the island's labyrinthine defenses. The centerpiece of the defense was the island's network of underground tunnels, miles of hidden passageways and bunkers that connected various defensive positions, providing cover and concealment for the Japanese soldiers. The tunnels were not just simple shelters, they were strategically placed, allowing the defenders to launch surprise attacks, regroup, and evade direct assaults. Many of these tunnels led to well-guarded strongholds that housed artillery pieces and ammunition depots, ensuring that the Japanese defenders could continue fighting for days or weeks without needing to expose themselves to American fire. Kurabayashi's forces also dug a series of bunkers and observation posts that were fortified with concrete and steel. These bunkers were often camouflaged to blend in with the island's natural landscape, making them difficult to spot from the air or on the ground. The Japanese soldiers could observe the movements of the Americans from these positions, carefully selecting their targets before firing on the advancing troops. When the Americans came within range, the defenders would strike with everything they had: mortars, machine guns, and rifles, all aimed to inflict as much damage as possible before retreating into the protection of the tunnels and bunkers. At key points on the island, the Japanese also placed artillery positions, including anti-aircraft guns and field artillery, which were capable of inflicting significant damage on American landing ships and aircraft. These guns were positioned to take advantage of the island's topography, hidden behind rock outcroppings and dense vegetation, making them difficult to target or neutralize. These positions were also linked to the tunnels, allowing for a seamless transition between defense and retreat as the battle progressed. General Kurabayashi's strategy was built around the idea of delaying the American advance, forcing them to fight for every inch of ground on the island. Unlike previous Japanese defenders who had relied on the traditional tactics of charging into battle and fighting for their positions, Kurabayashi had prepared his men to fight from the shadows. He instructed his soldiers not to engage in costly, futile charges but to stand their ground and then retreat deeper into the tunnels, only to strike again at the right moment. This strategy of attrition would force the Americans to waste precious resources and manpower, stretching their supply lines and morale to their breaking point. Kurabayashi also understood that surrender was not an option. His orders to his troops were clear: they would fight to the death and not give up their positions under any circumstances. The loss of Iwo Jima was, in his mind, inevitable, but he was determined to make the Americans pay for every inch of ground they gained. He believed that by inflicting such heavy casualties, he could not only delay the Allied advance but also send a message to the world about Japan's unwillingness to submit. His leadership, combined with the fortified defenses on the island, made Iwo Jima a formidable challenge for the American forces. The Japanese defenders, though outnumbered, were prepared to use every resource available to them, whether it was the cover of the tunnels or the devastating firepower of their artillery. They fought with a relentless determination, knowing that the island was their last stand and that their lives would likely end in the process. As the invasion date approached, the American intelligence about Iwo Jima had already indicated the strength of the Japanese defenses. but no amount of intelligence could fully prepare the U.S. forces for the brutal reality they would face when they landed. The defense of Iwo Jima would be a battle unlike any other in the Pacific War, and the Japanese defenders were determined to ensure that it would be a battle no one would forget. As the Iwo Jima invasion loomed, the U.S. military began its meticulous preparations for what would become one of the most brutal and pivotal battles of the Pacific War. With the strategic importance of the island firmly in mind, the American command set in motion a complex series of plans, drawing on years of experience gained from previous island assaults in the Pacific. However, Iwo Jima presented unique challenges, both in terms of its fortified defenses and the fierce Japanese resolve to defend it at all costs. At the heart of the American strategy were two men who would play pivotal roles in shaping the battle's approach: Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and General Holland Smith. Admiral Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was tasked with overseeing the overall strategic direction of the campaign. Known for his calm demeanor and methodical approach, Nimitz understood that the battle for Iwo Jima would be pivotal in the final stages of the war in the Pacific. He recognized that the island, though small in size, would provide critical support for the B-29 Superfortress bombers, essential to the continued Allied bombing campaign over Japan. Iwo Jima's airfields would allow the American bombers to refuel on their way to strikes against the Japanese mainland, bringing a significant advantage to the Allied forces. Nimitz, who had been involved in planning previous operations like the Battle of Midway, carefully coordinated with other military branches, ensuring the combined strength of the Navy, Marine Corps, and Army would be mobilized. But despite all the resources available, the objective was clear: Iwo Jima would be a battle of attrition, requiring meticulous planning and incredible sacrifice. General Holland Smith, the leader of the U.S. Marine Corps forces, was selected to oversee the land assault on Iwo Jima. He, too, knew the stakes of the invasion. His experience in amphibious operations, particularly in the island-hopping campaign, had prepared him for this. Smith's Marines had already seen action in some of the most brutal and destructive battles of the Pacific, but Iwo Jima would present a unique challenge. The Japanese defense system on the island was unlike anything the U.S. Marines had faced before, with a complex network of tunnels, bunkers, and fortified artillery positions scattered across the terrain. The preparation for the assault on Iwo Jima began months in advance. Training exercises were conducted for the men who would be landing on the island. These Marines were trained not only to fight in the open but also to fight in the dark, underground world of the Japanese defense system. Special units were trained to deal with the island's underground bunkers and hidden artillery positions, and to combat the Japanese soldiers who would fight from within these tunnels. The logistics of the invasion were massive. Hundreds of ships were needed to carry the Marines, naval forces, and supplies necessary for the invasion. These included not only the landing ships but also vast fleets of aircraft carriers, battleships, and support vessels. The attack would be preceded by an intense naval bombardment to soften Japanese defenses, though it was understood that the bombings would likely have limited success given the island's deep fortifications. Psychologically, the invasion's scale and complexity weighed heavily on the troops. The Marines, well aware of the stubbornness of Japanese defenders, knew they would be facing a battle of attrition. The news of the fortified Japanese defenses on Iwo Jima, coupled with the horror stories of previous island invasions, created a climate of uncertainty and fear. Marines, already accustomed to the horrors of war, prepared themselves for what was expected to be an extraordinarily bloody fight. The prospect of heavy casualties hung over the operation like a dark cloud. The memories of battles like Tarawa and Guadalcanal still loomed large, each marked by high casualty rates, and the battle for Iwo Jima promised to be no different. In the days leading up to the invasion, Nimitz and Smith maintained constant communication, refining their plans and ensuring all contingencies were accounted for. They knew that every Marine landing on the island would be entering a cauldron of fire, with the Japanese determined to defend the island at all costs. But they also knew that taking Iwo Jima was not just about securing a piece of land, it was about creating a strategic foothold that would bring the Japanese homeland within reach. The American military machine worked tirelessly, preparing for the moment when the first Marine boots would hit the island's dark, volcanic sands. But it was not just the military that prepared for the battle. The American public, too, braced themselves for what was expected to be a battle of unprecedented ferocity. The stakes were high, and the cost would be measured in lives. As the invasion force gathered in the Pacific, the air was thick with tension, as the men aboard ships, aircraft, and landing craft knew they were about to face a battle that would test the limits of their strength, resolve, and spirit. The world would be watching as Iwo Jima, once just a small dot in the Pacific, became the epicenter of a confrontation that would forever alter the course of the war. February 19, 1945, marked the beginning of one of the most grueling and devastating battles of the Pacific War, the invasion of Iwo Jima. For the men who had been trained, drilled, and prepared for months, the day finally arrived when they would storm the black sands of the island. The first wave of U.S. Marines, each man knowing that his life could end on the beach, were loaded into landing crafts and launched from the transport ships that had brought them across the Pacific. The assault on Iwo Jima began with the explosive roar of artillery and the thunderous blasts of naval bombardment. The fleet of U.S. battleships, cruisers, and destroyers had spent days shelling the island in preparation for the landing. The goal was to soften Japanese defenses, clear out artillery positions, and destroy as many of the enemy's fortifications as possible. However, the fortifications on Iwo Jima were far more extensive than anticipated. The Japanese defenders, led by General Kurabayashi, had spent months constructing an elaborate system of tunnels and underground bunkers that could not be easily neutralized by naval fire. The bombardment had failed to achieve its desired effect, leaving much of the island's defensive network intact. As the Marines began their landing on the shores of Iwo Jima, they were met by immediate Japanese resistance. The beaches, far from being clear of enemy fire, were riddled with hidden machine gun nests and mortars. The Marines were forced to fight their way through a series of unpredictable and deadly obstacles as they pushed forward onto the island. The heavily fortified positions that the Japanese had built into the very rock of the island made it impossible for the Marines to advance easily. The beach became a cauldron of fire, with flames and explosions erupting across the sand as the Japanese fought from their hidden positions. Despite the overwhelming firepower of the U.S. Navy, the Japanese defenders showed no signs of retreating. They were well prepared, motivated by their commanders' orders to fight to the death. The Marines, though undeterred in their mission, were faced with increasing challenges. As they advanced, they found themselves caught in the deadly crossfire between well-camouflaged artillery positions and the Japanese infantry that fought fiercely from the underground bunkers. Every step forward was met with heavy fire, and the Marines began to realize just how difficult and costly the invasion would be. By the end of the first day, the Marines had managed to establish a foothold on the island, but at an enormous cost. Casualties mounted as the Japanese resistance grew stronger. The terrain of Iwo Jima, covered with loose volcanic ash and jagged rocks, slowed the progress of the Marines as they tried to push inland. Each step they took toward their objectives was measured not just in ground gained, but in human suffering. In the heat of the battle, many Marines became disoriented and exhausted. The intense heat, the dust storms, and the constant bombardment made fighting nearly impossible. The sound of Japanese artillery, machine guns, and rifles created an almost unrelenting cacophony of destruction. It was difficult to tell where the Japanese fire was coming from, and the Marines had to be constantly on guard, unable to relax even for a moment. The confusion of battle was compounded by the mental fatigue of fighting an enemy that had dug in deep, unwilling to yield even an inch of ground. One of the Marines who landed on the beaches that day recalled the initial assault as a nightmare. The air was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, smoke, and burning fuel as the Marines fought for their lives. The beach, once a promising starting point for the invasion, quickly became a death trap, with explosions sending bodies flying and wounded men calling out for help. But even amid the chaos, the Marines pressed forward, determined to take the island at any cost. By the second day of the invasion, it became clear that Iwo Jima would not fall easily. The Marines had gained some ground, but the island's defenses remained formidable. The fierce resistance of the Japanese would continue to challenge the American forces for the next 36 days. As the Marines moved deeper into the island, they faced an enemy that was committed to its defense, determined to hold the island no matter what the cost. For the U.S. commanders, the first days of the invasion were a harsh reminder that Japan was no longer the easy target they had hoped for. The battle for Iwo Jima would not be a quick victory, but a brutal campaign in which every inch of ground would be earned in blood. As the Marines pressed deeper onto the island of Iwo Jima, the true scope of the challenge they faced became starkly clear. The initial landings, though successful in establishing a beachhead, had barely scratched the surface of what would be a grueling battle. The volcanic sands that covered the island were far from the soft, sandy beaches the Americans had trained on. The thick, black ash clung to every footstep, making movement heavy and slow. Marines struggled to gain traction, their legs sinking into the fine sand as they pushed forward under the weight of their gear and the unrelenting fire from the Japanese defenders. The beach itself was a battlefield, a hellscape where every inch gained felt like a monumental effort. Japanese machine guns raked the shoreline, cutting down Marines as they attempted to establish their positions. Every time the men tried to push further up the beach, the resistance became more intense, and the cost of progress grew higher. The shoreline quickly became a killing field, as the Japanese defenders, dug in and entrenched, poured fire into the landing forces from concealed positions. The volcanic sand became a symbol of the island's brutal nature. It clung to weapons, food rations, and equipment, making basic tasks difficult. The dust would fill the air, reducing visibility and adding to the chaos as the Marines tried to adapt to the suffocating environment. The constant shelling, combined with the relentless heat and the blinding sand, made it feel like there was no respite. The Japanese defense strategy became evident as the Marines pressed forward. The enemy was not just entrenched on the surface, but deeply embedded in the island's underground. The Japanese defense strategy and their use of underground tunnels. The Japanese, under the command of General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, had created an elaborate system of underground tunnels and bunkers, turning the island into a fortress. These tunnels allowed Japanese soldiers to emerge from the depths to strike at the Marines, and then retreat into the safety of the subterranean network. The network of tunnels connected strategic points across the island, including artillery positions, machine gun nests, and ammunition storage, making it almost impossible for the Marines to pinpoint and eliminate all the Japanese forces. The Japanese defenders were well prepared for the assault. They had been instructed to fight to the death, with no intention of surrendering. Kurabayashi's orders were clear: inflict as many casualties as possible and delay the American advance for as long as possible. The Marines quickly realized that the battle would not be won by simply clearing the beaches or taking individual positions. It would require intense, sustained combat, with every corner of the island contested, every building a potential fortress, and every step forward paid for in blood. As the Marines began their advance from the beachhead, the island's true defensive nature became evident. The underground bunkers, well hidden within the volcanic rock, allowed the Japanese to launch deadly counterattacks and ambushes. They could strike the advancing Marines with mortars, machine guns, and small arms fire, only to disappear back into the network of tunnels before they could be targeted. Each step the Americans took toward the island's interior was met with fierce resistance and hidden traps, forcing the Marines to adapt quickly to the terrain and the enemy's tactics. The battle for Mount Suribachi and the iconic flag raising. The battle for Mount Suribachi, the highest point on the island, was one of the most iconic and significant moments of the entire campaign. From the early hours of the invasion, it became clear that Mount Suribachi was the key to the island's defense. Whoever controlled the mountain would hold the advantage in terms of visibility and strategic positioning. As the Marines advanced, they encountered fierce resistance from the Japanese, who were determined to hold the mountain at all costs. The difficult, rocky terrain of Suribachi's slopes made the climb even more treacherous. The Marines knew that capturing Suribachi would not only be a significant tactical victory but would also boost morale, both on the battlefield and back home. The American flag raising atop Suribachi would later become one of the most recognizable images of the war, symbolizing the fighting spirit of the United States and the sacrifices made during the battle. The Marines who reached the summit were met with an overwhelming sense of accomplishment and relief, but that moment of triumph was fleeting. Though they had planted the American flag on the island's highest peak, the battle was far from over. The Japanese continued to fight fiercely, refusing to surrender and making each victory the Marines claimed a hard-won one. The flag raising itself, captured in a famous photograph by Joe Rosenthal, became a symbol of American resolve and victory. Yet, for the men who had raised it, the flag was just a small moment in the larger, ongoing struggle. The battle for Iwo Jima would last for 36 more days, with each passing day costing more lives, as the Japanese defenders fought on from their hidden positions. As the battle for Iwo Jima raged on, one particular objective stood out above all others: Mount Suribachi. This cone-shaped volcano, rising 550 feet above the island's flat plains, was both a tactical necessity and a symbolic prize for the United States. To the Japanese, it was the key to defending the island, allowing them to control the surrounding areas, direct artillery fire, and spot advancing American forces. For the Americans, taking Suribachi was not just about gaining a strategic high ground, but about crushing the heart of the Japanese defense. The battle for Suribachi was characterized by intense fighting, grueling terrain, and fierce resistance from the entrenched Japanese defenders. The Japanese soldiers, stationed in well-fortified positions, fought relentlessly, determined to hold their ground. The steep slopes of Mount Suribachi, covered in loose volcanic ash and jagged rock, made the advance even more difficult for the Marines. Every inch gained required immense effort and unwavering determination, and each time the Marines thought they had cleared an obstacle, a new wave of Japanese fire would send them scrambling for cover. The Marines soon realized that taking Suribachi would not be a quick or easy victory. The Japanese defense, built into the island's terrain, was practically impenetrable. Hidden machine gun nests, well-positioned artillery pieces, and hidden sniper positions made the assault incredibly costly. The American forces, though advancing, were forced to slow their progress, unable to simply overrun the defenses with sheer force. Every step forward was met with enemy fire, and casualties mounted as Marines pushed forward against the brutal resistance. The Marines' struggle to reach the summit of Suribachi was not only a battle for strategic control, but a battle to break the spirit of the enemy. The Japanese knew that once Suribachi was lost, their grip on the island would be significantly weakened. However, they fought with the fierce resolve characteristic of the Imperial Army. General Kuribayashi's orders were clear: hold the mountain at all costs. The initial attempt to take Suribachi saw Marines moving slowly up the rocky slopes, suffering under the weight of both the terrain and the constant barrage of enemy fire. As the battle wore on, it became evident that the key to taking the mountain was not brute force, but tactical maneuvering and coordination. With every inch, the Marines encountered pockets of resistance, and it became a battle not just of strength, but of patience, endurance, and tactical precision. The significance of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi as a morale booster. After days of brutal fighting, the Marines finally reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. The sight that awaited them was not a quiet victory but a hard-earned triumph. On February 23, 1945, a small group of Marines, led by Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, raised the American flag atop the mountain, an act of immense symbolic significance. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi became a defining moment in the Battle of Iwo Jima, but it was also a morale booster for the men on the island and back home. For the American forces, the flag represented more than just a tactical victory, it was a symbol of defiance and resolve. The raising of the flag was seen as a turning point in the battle, a sign that the Marines had overcome the worst of the Japanese defenses and had secured the most vital position on the island. The iconic photograph of the flag being raised, captured by Joe Rosenthal, would later become one of the most enduring images of World War II. For the Marines, the flag represented the spirit of the American fight, the courage to face insurmountable odds, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. It symbolized not just the end of Japanese dominance on Iwo Jima, but the beginning of America's return to uncontested power in the Pacific. The sight of the flag, waving proudly atop Suribachi, was an image of triumph that would be deeply ingrained in the American consciousness for years to come. But for the men who raised it, the flag was not just a symbol of victory, it was a reminder of the cost of that victory. The Marines who planted the flag knew that the battle was far from over. Suribachi had been taken, but the island was still full of entrenched Japanese soldiers, determined to fight to the death. The battle was far from won, and the Marines understood that more blood would be shed before the final victory. The battle for Mount Suribachi was, in many ways, the heart of the battle for Iwo Jima. The island was not just a strategic location, it was a symbol of Japan's commitment to defend its empire. For the Americans, taking Suribachi was both a military objective and a psychological victory. It was a victory not just over the Japanese defenses, but over the idea of Japanese invincibility. The Marines had faced overwhelming resistance and were forced to fight with the understanding that the cost of victory would be measured in lives lost. But the flag raising was more than just a symbol of military triumph. It marked a moment when the spirit of America, of determination, sacrifice, and unity, was lifted for all to see. The Marines had planted the flag on Suribachi, but the flag also planted the idea that Iwo Jima would become the defining image of the Pacific War, an image that would inspire not only those on the island, but the entire American public, who were still reeling from the horrors of the war. As the battle for Iwo Jima pressed on, the true brutality of the island's defenses became painfully clear. Mount Suribachi had been captured, and the iconic flag raised, but the battle was far from over. The island's interior, once considered an open expanse, was now a maze of entrenched positions and fortified bunkers, each one manned by determined Japanese defenders. The Marines, after scaling the rugged slopes of Suribachi, were now faced with the task of fighting for every inch of land, pushing through the island's dense network of defensive positions. The Japanese had constructed a labyrinth of underground tunnels and bunkers that ran throughout the island. These tunnels connected a web of machine gun nests, mortars, and artillery positions, making it nearly impossible for the Marines to discern where the enemy was hiding. The Japanese forces fought with determination, making it clear that they would not surrender an inch of ground. In this deadly game of attrition, the Marines were forced to adapt quickly to the island's unpredictable nature. The Marines' adaptation to the unpredictable nature of the island's defenses. Fighting in Iwo Jima's interior was unlike any battle the U.S. Marines had faced before. The island's volcanic soil made it difficult to establish positions, and the terrain itself was an obstacle that slowed their progress. The Japanese defenders had the advantage of familiarity with the land, and their ability to move unseen through the underground tunnels gave them the upper hand in many skirmishes. To combat this, the Marines adjusted their tactics. While the initial beach assault had been marked by direct confrontation, the interior fighting required more subtle approaches. The Marines' reliance on air support, artillery bombardments, and flanking maneuvers became more pronounced. Every bunker or defensive position had to be cleared methodically, with Marines moving cautiously from one entrenched position to the next, fighting not just to advance but to stay alive. The dense network of tunnels made it necessary to dig in and clear each section of the island, inch by inch. They had to use flamethrowers to neutralize hidden positions and grenades to flush out entrenched defenders. The island, so seemingly barren from a distance, had become a complex, deadly web. The dense smoke from artillery, the smell of burning fuel and human flesh, and the constant sound of explosions were overwhelming. Still, the Marines moved forward, relentlessly pursuing their objective. Key confrontations and stories of individual bravery. Throughout the battle, the individual acts of bravery stood out in a landscape of suffering. The Marines, though often faced with overwhelming odds, continued to display extraordinary courage under fire. One of the most memorable stories is that of Private First Class Jacqueline H. Lucas, who, despite being wounded, continued to fight and protect his fellow Marines. Lucas, in one of the darkest moments of the battle, threw himself on a grenade to save the lives of his comrades. His actions, along with those of many other men, would later define the spirit of Iwo Jima, bravery in the face of inevitable sacrifice. Another significant story came from Lieutenant Colonel Harry Shoup, whose leadership was critical in leading his Marines through some of the most brutal house-to-house combat. Shoup's ability to maintain cohesion among his men, even when facing withering resistance from Japanese forces hidden in the rubble, became a beacon for others to follow. He led by example, staying at the front lines, coordinating with the Navy, and making tactical decisions that saved lives. As the Marines fought their way through the streets of Iwo Jima's interior, they encountered Japanese soldiers fighting with unmatched ferocity. In one such confrontation, the Marines stormed a set of fortified positions in the hills of the island. The Japanese soldiers, despite being outnumbered, refused to retreat and continued to fight until they had no more ammunition, often resorting to bayonets in hand-to-hand combat. For the Marines, these were the toughest battles, and the deaths of comrades in such fights left an indelible mark on their psyche. The intense, brutal combat on Iwo Jima was more than just a test of military might, it was a trial of the human spirit. The Marines fought not only for victory but also for their survival against an enemy that would fight until there was no more land to defend. The cost of this struggle, measured not just in lives lost, but in the emotional and psychological toll, would resonate with the survivors for years to come. Despite the progress they made, there was a palpable sense of foreboding as the battle raged on. Each day, the Marines saw their comrades fall, their sacrifices giving way to the relentless push toward victory. Yet, in the face of loss, the Marines demonstrated a resilience and determination that could not be extinguished. They fought for each other, driven by the memory of the men who had fallen before them. As the battle for Iwo Jima dragged on, the resolve of the Japanese defenders remained unbroken. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Japanese forces, led by General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, were determined to fight to the death. The island was now more than a piece of strategic terrain, it had become the final fortress in Japan's Pacific defense, a place where honor, pride, and defiance could hold the line against the Americans' advancing might. The refusal to surrender was not just an act of military strategy but also a manifestation of the deep-seated values embedded in the Japanese soldiers' mentality. General Kurabayashi, who had spent months preparing Iwo Jima for an eventual American assault, had given explicit orders to his men: there would be no surrender. The island was to be held at all costs, and the Japanese soldiers were expected to fight until the very last breath. In his orders, Kurabayashi stressed that surrender was not an option, and that the soldiers of the Imperial Army should die in battle, not in retreat. To Kurabayashi, Iwo Jima was not just a strategic outpost, it was a symbol of Japan's honor. The loss of the island would signal a fatal blow to the Japanese war effort, and it had to be defended at all costs. The impact of Kurabayashi's orders to defend the island at all costs. Kurabayashi's orders were clear: the defenders of Iwo Jima were to fight to the death, and, indeed, many of them did. The Japanese High Command had already prepared for the possibility of losing the island, but Kurabayashi's insistence on fighting until the last man made the battle far more costly for both sides. The Japanese forces would not surrender or retreat, but rather, would hold their positions in well-fortified defensive lines, dug into the island's rugged volcanic terrain. Kurabayashi's strategy of defense relied on an almost fanatical determination to resist the American advance. Instead of relying on conventional tactics, he ordered his forces to use the underground tunnels and bunkers to stage a series of ambushes and counterattacks, hoping to force the Americans into a costly, drawn-out battle of attrition. The island was booby-trapped and covered with defensive positions that allowed the Japanese to strike from unexpected locations. Every inch of ground became contested, and even the slightest movement was met with fierce retaliation. The Japanese soldiers, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, remained determined to carry out their orders. The toll on the Japanese forces as their positions become untenable. Despite their fierce resistance, the Japanese forces on Iwo Jima were outmatched in nearly every regard. The American forces brought overwhelming firepower, a superior air force, and massive artillery support to bear on the island. As the days passed, the once formidable Japanese defenses began to crumble. The Americans methodically cleared bunkers and tunnels, forcing the Japanese soldiers to retreat deeper into the island's interior, only to face more intense bombardment. The unrelenting naval and air bombardment, combined with the pressure from American ground forces, steadily pushed the defenders back. Yet, despite their dire circumstances, the Japanese forces refused to yield. The death toll mounted as the battle dragged on, and the Japanese soldiers who had initially believed in the island's strategic importance found themselves fighting for their very survival. The idea of retreat was foreign to them, surrender was simply not an option. In the tunnels and bunkers, Japanese soldiers endured horrific conditions, living in constant fear of American airstrikes, artillery fire, and close-quarters combat. The realization that their positions were becoming untenable only strengthened their resolve to fight to the end. There was no hope for victory, only the grim reality of a fight for survival, and eventually, for death. Tragic heroism, the destruction of a nation's last hope. As the battle wore on, the last remnants of the Japanese defense were forced into the most remote and isolated parts of the island. Kurabayashi's leadership and the fierce resistance of his troops were emblematic of the tragic heroism that defined the Japanese effort at Iwo Jima. Their sacrifice, though ultimately futile, reflected the intense loyalty they felt toward their nation and their emperor. The willingness of the Japanese soldiers to die for their country, even in the face of certain defeat, stands as one of the most powerful symbols of honor and determination. But as the Americans systematically destroyed the Japanese positions, it became clear that the cost of honor had been overwhelming. The loss of Iwo Jima was a catastrophic blow to the Japanese war effort, one that would not only diminish their defensive capabilities but also severely damage their morale. The soldiers who had once been proud defenders of the empire now faced the reality that their sacrifice had been in vain. Their actions, though brave and resolute, could not prevent the inevitable. Iwo Jima, once a symbol of imperial strength, had become a graveyard, marking the end of Japan's dominance in the Pacific. Kurabayashi's orders had led to the destruction of much of Japan's last remaining military strength on the island, leaving them unable to recover from the loss. Iwo Jima, as a fortified position, had become the final stand for a nation whose ambitions in the Pacific were quickly unraveling. The tragedy was not just in the loss of life, but in the wasted potential, the lives of soldiers who had given everything for a cause that could not succeed. The battle for Iwo Jima proved to be a test of endurance and sacrifice unlike any other. As the Marines pushed forward through the island's rugged terrain, the cost of victory became increasingly clear. The initial optimism and determination that had characterized the American landings soon gave way to the grim reality of heavy casualties and the brutal toll that such an intense battle would exact on both sides. From the first landing on February 19, 1945, to the final push toward the island's interior, Iwo Jima exacted a terrible price. The United States Marines, though well-trained and equipped with overwhelming firepower, suffered nearly 7,000 dead and over 20,000 wounded. The wounded would return to the rear, but the dead would not come back. The Marines, though hardened by previous battles in the Pacific, found themselves facing an enemy that refused to surrender, with each inch of ground costing them more lives. The Japanese defenders, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a fanatical resolve. General Tadamaki Kurabayashi's orders to hold Iwo Jima until the last man meant that the battle quickly became a war of attrition. The Japanese soldiers were not just fighting for territory, they were fighting for their honor and for the empire they believed in. By the end of the battle, more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, with only around 1,000 surviving to be taken as prisoners of war. The cost of this victory, for both sides, was staggering. The brutal nature of the battle was reflected in the high number of casualties, particularly for the Marines who had to fight not just against an enemy, but against the terrain, the environment, and the psychological toll of a battle that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The emotional and physical toll on the Marines and their commanders. For the Marines, the battle for Iwo Jima was not just a test of physical endurance, but an emotional and psychological struggle. The Marines had been trained for war, but no amount of training could prepare them for the harrowing experiences of fighting in the black volcanic sands, where every step was met with the risk of death or injury. The sound of artillery, the crack of machine gun fire, and the constant threat of snipers made every moment on the island a battle for survival. The emotional toll on the Marines was immense. Close friends and comrades were lost every day, and the feeling of helplessness was ever present. In many cases, individual bravery was the only thing that separated survival from death. Marines would often find themselves fighting through their own exhaustion and fear, knowing that the enemy was as resolute as they were. The Marine commanders, too, felt the weight of responsibility. The decision to move forward with the invasion, knowing the cost it would bring, weighed heavily on their shoulders. While the American military knew that victory would eventually come, the bravery of their men was matched only by the sacrifice it would demand. General Holland Smith, the commander of the U.S. Marine forces in the battle, understood the tremendous loss of life that would occur, but he knew that the capture of Iwo Jima was crucial to the success of the broader war effort. Smith, and his fellow commanders, faced a terrible paradox. They were tasked with ensuring the success of the mission while knowing the human cost. They had to lead men into the fight with the understanding that the victory would be hard-won, and paid for in blood. The weight of that knowledge was an invisible burden that each Marine commander carried throughout the battle. Yet, through it all, they could not falter. The mission was too important. The stakes were too high. Victory was the only option, but the emotional toll of achieving it was undeniable. Reflections on the nature of war and sacrifice. The battle for Iwo Jima ultimately stood as a reflection of the true nature of war, a struggle not just of armies, but of human spirit, resolve, and sacrifice. For the Marines, it was an experience that would be ingrained in their minds forever. They had come to the island as young men, eager to serve their country, but they left it as veterans forever altered by what they had witnessed and endured. The sacrifices made on Iwo Jima would echo in the hearts of the survivors for the rest of their lives. Many would return home to face physical injuries, but it was the psychological wounds, the trauma of war, the loss of comrades, the relentless days spent in combat, that would haunt them for years to come. The emotional scars were just as deep as the physical ones, and the effects of Iwo Jima would follow them long after the war was over. For the Japanese defenders, the cost of the battle was equally high. Their refusal to surrender, guided by the orders of General Kurabayashi, ultimately led to their complete destruction. Their heroism, while tragic, was a reflection of their deep loyalty to their emperor and their nation. But in the end, their sacrifice did not bring them victory. The Japanese High Command, too, would later reflect on the costs of such stubborn resistance. The battle, while heroic, had been a lost cause from the start, and the human toll was a reminder of the futility of war and the high price of pride. The Battle of Iwo Jima was not just a pivotal moment in the Pacific War, it was a defining chapter in the larger narrative of the conflict. As the dust settled on the black sands, the cost of the victory began to reveal itself. The strategic importance of Iwo Jima, while initially underestimated by some, would become undeniable in the final stages of the war. It had been the stepping stone to Japan's doorstep, a vital piece of territory that would provide critical support for the Allies as they prepared for the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands. Iwo Jima's capture allowed the United States to secure a forward base that would become essential in the island-hopping campaign. The island's airfields were used to refuel B-29 Superfortress bombers, allowing them to extend their reach and conduct increasingly devastating raids over Japan. The capture of Iwo Jima also provided the Allies with control of the skies over the Pacific, ensuring that future attacks on the Japanese homeland would be far more effective and less risky. It was a crucial win that contributed directly to the eventual downfall of the Japanese Empire. Yet, the strategic importance of Iwo Jima was not the only legacy the battle left behind. It would come to symbolize something much deeper, the sacrifice and endurance of those who fought and died there, on both sides. The images of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi, immortalized in photographs and memorials, would become symbols of American resolve and the cost of war. The men who fought at Iwo Jima were not just soldiers, they were participants in a moment of history that would shape the future of nations. The significance of the battle in American military history. The battle for Iwo Jima would go on to be remembered as one of the most critical and bloody battles in American military history. The Marine Corps, which had already earned its reputation through previous engagements in the Pacific, proved once again its ability to adapt and overcome under extreme duress. The tactics and training that had been refined during earlier battles, such as those in Guadalcanal and Tarawa, were put to the test on the island of Iwo Jima, and the Marines rose to the challenge. The costs of Iwo Jima were enormous. With over 6,800 Americans killed and more than 20,000 wounded, the island became a symbol of sacrifice for the nation. The Marines' perseverance in the face of such brutality was seen as a testament to the strength and resolve of the American fighting spirit. The battle would solidify the Marine Corps' legacy, further establishing the U.S. as a dominant force in global military affairs. However, the victory at Iwo Jima also marked the end of the Pacific's defensive phase for Japan. The loss of the island, combined with the ongoing U.S. advances through the Pacific, forced Japan into an increasingly untenable position. While Iwo Jima would remain a symbol of American triumph, it was also the beginning of the end for Japan's imperial ambitions in the Pacific. The long-term impact on veterans and Japanese survivors. The effects of the battle would not be confined to the military leaders and soldiers who fought on Iwo Jima. For the veterans who survived the campaign, the emotional and psychological toll was profound. Many would carry the scars of Iwo Jima for the rest of their lives. The trauma of the battle, where friends and comrades were lost at such an alarming rate, left deep wounds that could not be easily healed. For some, the memories of combat would stay with them forever, while others would find ways to move forward, even though the images of battle would never fully fade from their minds. In the years following the battle, Iwo Jima veterans became a tight-knit group, bound by the shared experiences of the island's brutal combat. They would gather at reunions and memorials, finding solace in one another's company. Over time, the stories of bravery and loss became part of the collective memory of the war, and the veterans' accounts of their experiences would be passed down through generations. Yet for many, the battle would remain a defining experience, one that shaped their lives long after the fighting had stopped. For the Japanese survivors, the cost of the battle was equally significant. The defenders of Iwo Jima, who had fought with such fierce determination, were often left to reflect on their defeat in the aftermath. The men who survived the battle were not only physically scarred, but they also carried the burden of failure. The soldiers who had been ordered to hold the island until death found themselves trapped in a losing cause, their loyalty to Japan's imperial cause now shattered. Many of the Japanese survivors were taken as prisoners of war and held in American internment camps. For some, the sense of shame and humiliation was immense. They had fought for an empire that was now falling apart, and their defeat at Iwo Jima marked the beginning of the end for Japan's imperial ambitions. The survivors, like their American counterparts, would carry the weight of Iwo Jima with them for the rest of their lives. The battle for Iwo Jima was a test of endurance and courage, but for the U.S. Marines who fought there, it was also a deeply personal experience. Beyond the military strategies and tactics, it was the individual stories of bravery, sacrifice, and resilience that defined the true cost of the battle. Each Marine who landed on the black sands of Iwo Jima carried with him not just the weight of his weapon and gear, but the emotional burden of the men who had come before him, and the fear of what he might face on the island. The constant combat that the Marines faced throughout the 36 days of battle took an immense toll. The Japanese defenders, dug deep into the island's volcanic rock, used underground tunnels, bunkers, and hidden artillery positions to launch surprise attacks on the Marines at every turn. There was no safe place, no place where the sound of battle didn't echo. The island's terrain, rocky, treacherous, and covered with loose volcanic ash, made movement slow and difficult. Marines were often forced to fight not just the enemy, but the island itself. For many, the initial landing on February 19, 1945, felt like an endless nightmare. As they charged up the beaches, they encountered fierce resistance from the Japanese, who were entrenched in well-prepared positions. As the Marines pushed forward, they were forced to face the brutal reality of battle, friends falling beside them, the cries of wounded comrades, and the sound of artillery fire tearing through the air. The beach, once considered the entry point to victory, quickly became a kill zone, where advancing forces were bogged down by heavy fire. Stories of individual courage and sacrifice. Amidst the overwhelming odds, the Marines demonstrated extraordinary bravery. The battle for Iwo Jima was marked by countless acts of individual courage, where Marines showed selflessness and resolve in the face of unimaginable danger. One of the most iconic examples of such bravery came from Private First Class Jacqueline H. Lucas, who, despite being severely wounded, threw himself on a grenade to save his fellow Marines. His actions would later earn him the Medal of Honor, but for him and many others, such acts were not about medals, they were about duty and survival. Another story of personal courage came from Lieutenant Colonel Harry Shoup, whose leadership was instrumental in pushing the Marines forward through the treacherous interior of Iwo Jima. Shoup was known for his courage under fire, staying at the front lines and leading his men into some of the most dangerous areas of the island. In one particularly harrowing confrontation, Shoup and his Marines came under heavy fire while attempting to clear out an entrenched Japanese position. Despite the odds, Shoup led the charge, rallying his men even as casualties mounted. The toll of constant combat and the psychological strain on soldiers. While the acts of heroism were countless, the psychological toll of the battle was equally profound. The Marines, already hardened from previous island campaigns, found themselves pushed to their physical and emotional limits. Iwo Jima was a place where the fear of death was ever present, and the constant barrage of enemy fire, combined with the heat, the suffocating volcanic ash, and the mental fatigue, began to break even the strongest. The psychological strain of constant combat, combined with the heavy losses sustained throughout the battle, caused many of the Marines to experience what would later be identified as combat stress, or shell shock. Some Marines lost the ability to think clearly under fire, while others simply shut down, overwhelmed by the brutal realities of war. The constant noise of battle, the explosions, the cries of the wounded, the screams of men under fire, wore down the Marines' mental resilience. One Marine, who would later speak of his experience, recalled the constant fear of the unknown. You never knew where the enemy was. You couldn't see them, but you could hear them, and they could see you. You just kept moving, trying not to think about the guys who weren't coming back. The emotional toll was also felt by the commanders, who had the added burden of decision-making that would determine the fate of their men. For General Holland Smith, leading the Marines into Iwo Jima was a responsibility that weighed heavily on his shoulders. He knew the cost of the battle, knew that victory was possible, but also understood the toll it would take. In his private reflections, Smith would later express the regret of knowing that the battle would claim the lives of so many of his men, despite the eventual victory. The true cost of Iwo Jima went far beyond the immediate casualties. The physical and emotional scars left on the Marines and their commanders would stay with them long after the battle was over. The survivors of Iwo Jima would return home, but they would never truly leave the island behind. The men who had fought there would carry the memories of the battle with them for the rest of their lives, the faces of the comrades they had lost, the horrors they had witnessed, and the unfathomable courage they had shown in the face of overwhelming adversity. The battle for Iwo Jima was not a struggle that the U.S. Marines could fight alone. The U.S. Navy and Air Force played a critical role in supporting the Marine assault, providing both firepower and strategic assistance to ensure the success of the invasion. The combined forces of land, air, and sea would become the key to overcoming the fortified defenses and determined resistance that awaited the Marines on the island. The initial phase of the invasion was supported by a relentless series of naval bombardments. The U.S. Navy's battleships, cruisers, and destroyers fired upon the island's defenses for days before the Marines landed, hoping to soften up the Japanese positions. These bombardments were intended to destroy Japanese artillery, machine gun nests, and other key fortifications, making the Marine assault less costly. However, the battle for Iwo Jima would reveal the limitations of this tactic. Many of the Japanese defenses were so well entrenched and concealed underground that even the powerful naval firepower could not neutralize them entirely. Despite this, the Navy's bombardments did succeed in suppressing some of the Japanese defenses, clearing a path for the Marines to land. On February 19, 1945, when the Marines made their first assault on the island, they were met by a relentless barrage of gunfire from the Japanese defenders. But they were not alone. The U.S. Navy provided close naval gunfire support, with warships positioned just offshore, firing directly at enemy positions. This fire support was essential in helping the Marines advance through the bloody beach landings, providing a measure of protection from the heavily fortified Japanese positions. Naval bombardments and airstrikes designed to soften Japanese defenses. Even as the Marines fought on the ground, the U.S. Navy's aircraft took to the skies, launching airstrikes against Japanese targets on the island. The Navy's carrier-based planes, including dive bombers and torpedo bombers, attacked with precision, aiming to disrupt the Japanese command and control and target hidden positions. The Navy's air superiority was critical for ensuring that the Marines could advance without being completely overwhelmed by Japanese air and artillery fire. Despite the continuous bombardments and airstrikes, the Japanese defense of Iwo Jima remained fierce. The Navy's firepower was effective in some areas, but it was the Marines' ground combat and their own ability to adapt to the enemy's tactics that would ultimately decide the outcome. The complexity of multi-force warfare, the combination of naval, air, and ground operations, made coordination essential. Any failure in communication between these forces could lead to catastrophic losses. One of the challenges the Navy and Marines faced was the difficult coordination between the naval fire support, airstrikes, and the marine assault. The geography of Iwo Jima, with its rocky terrain and hidden Japanese positions, created problems for targeting. Some Japanese artillery positions and bunkers were shielded from view, making it difficult for naval guns and aircraft to strike them effectively. Furthermore, the dynamic nature of the battle, with ever-changing positions and a shifting front line, created logistical challenges for coordinating attacks. Despite these challenges, the Navy and Air Force continued to provide essential support for the Marines. Their coordination was crucial in maintaining momentum during the invasion. The Marines depended on air support to neutralize Japanese aircraft on the island, as well as artillery support from the Navy to suppress enemy fire. As the battle evolved, American aircraft continued to launch bombing raids, and Navy ships continued to bombard key targets, ensuring that the Marines had the firepower they needed to push forward. The challenges of coordinating multiple forces under stressful conditions. The complexity of coordinating the marine assault, naval bombardments, and air support under the intense pressure of battle was immense. On Iwo Jima, there was no time for hesitation. The speed and fluidity of the battle meant that synchronization between the branches of the military had to be flawless, and at times, this was difficult to achieve. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz and his team in the Pacific Command worked tirelessly to ensure that the U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, and Army Air Force were properly coordinated. Marines on the ground relied heavily on naval fire support to protect them from Japanese counterattacks, while airstrikes from the U.S. Air Force would need to strike from above. The American commanders had to ensure that these efforts worked in unison, even though the stakes were incredibly high. But despite the difficulties of coordination, the combined efforts of the Navy and Air Force helped to mitigate some of the losses that the Marines would otherwise have endured. The constant barrage from ships and planes kept the Japanese defenders off balance, preventing them from massing their forces in one place and allowing the Marines to push forward, despite heavy losses. Coordinated chaos, the complexity of multi-force warfare. The battle for Iwo Jima was a stark example of the challenges and the power of coordinating multiple military forces. The Navy's bombardments and airstrikes, while essential, were not enough on their own. It was the combined effort, ground, air, and sea, that ultimately pushed the Marines through the island, overcoming fierce opposition. The invasion of Iwo Jima proved that modern warfare required the flawless coordination of multiple branches of the military, each playing a pivotal role in the battle's outcome. As the Battle of Iwo Jima unfolded, the Japanese defenders demonstrated an unwavering resolve that made the battle far more costly than anyone had anticipated. Led by General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, the defenders of Iwo Jima fought not just to hold the island but to protect the honor of the empire itself. Their fierce resistance, rooted in the ideology of honor and duty, would leave an indelible mark on the Marines who fought against them. The defense tactics employed, including the use of underground tunnels and bunkers. The island of Iwo Jima, with its rugged volcanic landscape, was an ideal location for defensive warfare. Kurabayashi had ordered the construction of a vast network of underground tunnels and bunkers, turning the island into a fortified labyrinth. The Japanese defenders made use of the island's natural terrain, building tunnels into the volcanic rock, where they could hide from the relentless American bombardment. These tunnels connected different defensive positions across the island, including artillery positions, machine gun nests, and ammunition depots. The defenders could move underground, out of sight from American fire, and re-emerge to strike at the advancing Marines. The bunkers, camouflaged and fortified with steel and concrete, were key to the Japanese defense strategy. These strongholds allowed the Japanese soldiers to fight from well-protected positions while minimizing exposure to American artillery and airstrikes. The bunkers were designed to house machine guns, mortars, and heavy artillery, all aimed at stalling the Marines' advance. The Japanese also constructed cave systems designed to house snipers, who would emerge unexpectedly to pick off Marines, sowing confusion and fear. The tunnels and bunkers allowed the Japanese forces to extend the fight for longer than anticipated, turning what could have been a rapid conquest into an incredibly costly battle. The leadership and determination of Admiral Kurabayashi and his men. General Kurabayashi understood the strategic importance of Iwo Jima and knew the island was the last line of defense before the Japanese home islands. Yet, despite the overwhelming American superiority, he was determined to make the fight as costly as possible. His leadership was crucial in shaping the battle. Unlike many of his predecessors who favored mass charges and sacrificial tactics, Kurabayashi made a decision to hold his ground and fight defensively, not through frontal assaults, but by digging in and using the island's fortifications to his advantage. Kurabayashi, despite knowing the inevitability of defeat, took personal responsibility for his men. He motivated his soldiers by appealing to their sense of duty and loyalty to the emperor, reminding them that their honor depended on their refusal to surrender. His orders were clear: the defenders were to fight until the last man, and they were to do so with the knowledge that their efforts would delay the American invasion of Japan's home islands, potentially buying time for reinforcements to arrive. Kurabayashi's men followed these orders with unyielding resolve, fighting not just for survival but for the honor of the empire. Even when their positions became untenable, even when casualties mounted, the Japanese soldiers fought with determination, their will as strong as their commitment to their cause. The iron will of the Japanese defenders was evident in every encounter, as they held their ground and fought, often to the death, knowing that surrender was not an option. Kurabayashi's leadership and the discipline of the Japanese forces were matched only by their sacrifice. Each man, whether officer or enlisted, knew the cost of their defense. The tactical defense of Iwo Jima would stand as a tribute to the strength of the Japanese military ethos, where honor, duty, and loyalty were considered worth the ultimate sacrifice. Relentless resolve, the cost of honor and duty. In the face of overwhelming American forces, the Japanese defenders never wavered. The sacrifice of their lives was considered a duty, an expression of their commitment to their country and their emperor. To the Japanese soldiers, dying on Iwo Jima was not a failure but a noble sacrifice for the greater good of their empire. The battle was not only about defending Iwo Jima but about defending the ideals and the honor of Japan itself. As the Marines advanced, it became apparent that the Japanese were not simply fighting for survival, but for a cause that they believed would lead to eventual victory, even in the face of certain death. This was the cost of honor, the willingness to fight until the last breath, knowing that defeat was inevitable, but doing so with the resolve that one's sacrifice would be remembered, and that it would contribute to Japan's continued fight in the Pacific. The tragic heroism of the Japanese defenders was bittersweet. While they fought with extraordinary courage, their sacrifice would prove to be in vain. The loss of Iwo Jima, combined with the island's strategic importance, would pave the way for the American advance toward the Japanese home islands. Iwo Jima, as the last defensive bastion before the heart of Japan, would be remembered as a symbol of the ultimate price paid by the Japanese soldiers, who fought not just for territory but for a nation they believed was worth dying for. On February 23, 1945, just days into the battle for Iwo Jima, the Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi. The battle for the island had already claimed many lives, and the cost of taking the strategic peak had been steep. Yet, as the first wave of Marines planted the American flag atop the mountain, a powerful symbol of victory was born, one that would resonate not only with those fighting on the island but with the American public in the entire world. The sight of the flag waving proudly on Mount Suribachi became the defining image of the battle. The photograph taken by Joe Rosenthal would immortalize the moment in the hearts and minds of every American, a powerful reminder of the sacrifice and resolve that defined the Marines' effort. The raising of the flag was more than just a military victory, it was a symbolic gesture, a moment of redemption, signaling the turning of the tide in the Pacific War. The symbolism of the event and its impact on American morale. For the American forces, the flag raising on Mount Suribachi was a moment of triumph amidst the grueling and costly battle. As the flag rose into the air, it became a symbol of American perseverance and the endurance of its fighting men. It was a visible sign that despite the heavy losses sustained during the invasion, the Marines had successfully captured the highest point on the island, the heart of Japan's defense. The American public, already weary from the long war, found new hope and determination in the image of the flag on Suribachi. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and General Dwight D. Eisenhower saw the flag raising as a momentous achievement. It was seen as a definitive sign that the American forces were on the path to ultimate victory. The American media quickly picked up the photograph, using it in newspapers and posters across the country to inspire national pride. The sacrifice and victory represented by the flag were woven into the fabric of American identity, becoming synonymous with the strength and resolve of the U.S. military. For the Marines fighting on the island, the moment was a powerful psychological victory. The sight of the flag waving on Suribachi provided moral support to the men who had been enduring relentless combat. Though the battle was far from over, the flag raising was a tangible reminder that the tide had turned in the war. It lifted the spirits of the weary Marines, who had been pushed to their limits, and symbolized the beginning of the end for Japan's defensive efforts. Behind-the-scenes stories of the men involved in the flag raising. While the raising of the flag would go on to become one of the most iconic moments of World War II, the men involved in the act would have their own personal reflections on what it meant. The men who were selected to carry out the flag raising were part of a group led by Lieutenant Colonel Chandler W. Johnson, who had been charged with leading the attack on Mount Suribachi. The Marines who actually raised the flag included Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Private First Class Ira Hayes, Private First Class Renee Gagnon, and Lieutenant Harold Schreier. Each of these men had played a crucial role in taking Mount Suribachi, but they would also become part of a broader historical moment. The men who raised the flag were not aware of the significance of their actions as they ascended the mountain. Their primary focus was on continuing the fight and securing the island. The flag raising was, for them, an afterthought, a simple gesture that would later come to represent so much more. Ira Hayes, one of the flag raisers, would later speak of his mixed emotions about the photograph. While the flag raising brought hope to the American people, Hayes, like many of the men on the island, felt conflicted about the attention that came with it, especially as the battle continued and the cost of victory continued to rise. Triumphant yet bittersweet, the flag is a symbol of sacrifice. While the flag raising on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of hope and victory, it was also bittersweet for those who fought and died at Iwo Jima. The photograph, now one of the most recognized images in history, did not tell the full story of the sacrifice and struggle involved in achieving it. For every Marine who made it to the top of Suribachi, many more were left behind on the beach or in the trenches. The heavy casualties suffered by the Marines, over 6,800 killed, cast a shadow over the symbolic flag raising. The men who fought to raise that flag were aware of the cost of their victory, and the flag itself became a reminder of what had been lost. For Ira Hayes, Franklin Sousley, and others who survived, the flag was not just a symbol of victory, but also a representation of the brothers they had lost along the way. As the Marines continued to fight through the island, the iconic flag became a moral beacon that pushed them onward. But it was also a haunting reminder of the sacrifices that had been made, the lives lost in pursuit of victory. The flag was a symbol of hope, yes, but it was also a symbol of the terrible cost of war. In the years to come, the image of the flag raising would become inextricably linked to the memory of Iwo Jima, not just as a military victory, but as a testament to sacrifice, unity, and the unshakable resolve of the men who fought there. It would forever symbolize the endurance of the American spirit in the face of adversity, and the selfless courage that would define Iwo Jima as one of the most significant and heartbreaking battles of the Pacific War. The battle for Iwo Jima stands as one of the most costly and intense engagements of the Pacific War. Though the American victory was a decisive step toward Japan's eventual defeat, the price of that victory was staggering. Over 6,800 American Marines lost their lives on the island, and nearly 20,000 Japanese soldiers were killed defending it. The island, once a symbol of Japanese resistance, had become a sacrifice zone, the ultimate cost paid for control of the Pacific. The battle, which lasted 36 days, was a bloody confrontation that left deep scars on both the Americans who fought there and the Japanese soldiers who held out to the death. The terrible cost of taking Iwo Jima was not just in the number of lives lost, but in the emotional and psychological toll it took on those who lived through it. The impact of the battle on U.S. Marines, both physically and emotionally. For the U.S. Marines, the battle for Iwo Jima was nothing short of hellish. The initial landings on February 19, 1945, saw the Marines face intense enemy fire and difficult terrain. The volcanic ash that blanketed the island made movement slower and more exhausting, as it clung to every surface, making the Marines' progress seem endless. The constant shelling, combined with hidden Japanese snipers and underground defenses, created a nightmarish environment where no one felt truly safe. The physical toll was immense. The Marines were pushed to their physical limits by the combination of harsh terrain, constant bombardment, and the unrelenting combat. Those who survived the landings soon found themselves in a war of attrition, fighting inch by inch, clearance by clearance, against an enemy that would not yield. As the battle continued, casualties mounted. Marines were killed by artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire, and many others were left wounded, their injuries often making them unable to continue the fight. Even the most resilient Marines found themselves physically and mentally drained as the days stretched on. The emotional cost was just as severe. The Marines were not only fighting an enemy, but also their fear, their fatigue, and the growing awareness of just how high the price of victory would be. They were forced to come to terms with the loss of comrades, the endless flood of casualties, and the overwhelming odds. Each day they moved forward, they did so knowing that the enemy was unyielding, that their sacrifices might not bring them victory, and that they might never see home again. The sense of isolation and exhaustion hung over them, making the battle not only a test of strength, but a test of will. Japanese forces' unwillingness to surrender, leading to nearly complete annihilation. For the Japanese forces, the battle for Iwo Jima was one of total resistance and sacrifice. Under the leadership of General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, the Japanese soldiers were given clear orders. They were to fight to the death, refusing to surrender or retreat. The entrenched Japanese defense strategy, combined with a deep sense of honor and loyalty to their emperor, ensured that no ground would be easily given. The Japanese soldiers, deeply embedded in the island's underground tunnel system, were determined to resist American advances at every turn. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Japanese defenders fought with fury and tenacity, utilizing the island's natural fortifications and tactical ingenuity. They attacked from hidden positions, emerging from tunnels to launch surprise assaults, only to vanish back into the labyrinth of bunkers and caves. The decision to fight to the death led to nearly total annihilation of the Japanese forces. In the end, less than 1,000 Japanese soldiers survived, and many of them were captured only after they had fought to the bitter end. The rest died either in combat or by suicide, following the Bushido code that emphasized honor in death rather than surrender. This refusal to yield became one of the defining characteristics of the Japanese defense of Iwo Jima, adding to the immense cost of the battle. As the battle neared its end, the surrender was not even a consideration for the remaining Japanese soldiers. Many chose to die by their own hands rather than fall into the hands of the Americans. This fierce commitment to their cause, while tragic, also illustrated the depth of loyalty and honor that the Japanese soldiers felt toward their emperor and country. Somber reality, the brutal price of victory. When the dust finally settled and the battle for Iwo Jima came to a close, the true cost of victory became painfully clear. The American Marines had succeeded in taking the island, but at a heavy price. The losses were staggering. Over 6,800 American Marines were killed, and many more were wounded, many of whom would carry the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The battle, while ultimately a victory, was a bittersweet triumph, a victory that would forever be marked by the lives lost and the trauma endured. For the Japanese, the price was even higher. Nearly all of their defenders were wiped out, leaving their positions and sacrifices rendered futile in the face of overwhelming American strength. Their determination to fight until the end led to a complete military annihilation, marking the death of the Japanese Navy and a decisive blow to their defense capabilities in the Pacific. But beyond the raw numbers of dead and wounded, the true cost of the battle was in the emotional and psychological toll it took on both the American and Japanese forces. Iwo Jima had been a battle of extreme sacrifice, with the American Marines and Japanese defenders facing death head-on in a way few battles in history had demanded. The lives lost were not merely numbers on a casualty report, but the individual stories of soldiers, each driven by their own motivations, ideals, and duty. As the battle ended, the Americans celebrated their victory, but the weight of the human cost remained. Iwo Jima was not just a strategic gain, it was a symbol of sacrifice, of men who gave everything for a cause, whether it was for their country or for their comrades. The island had become a graveyard, a place where the price of victory had been paid in full. The Battle of Iwo Jima, though one of the bloodiest battles of World War II, left a legacy that would profoundly shape post-war military strategy and U.S. naval doctrine. The capture of Iwo Jima not only allowed the Allies to strengthen their strategic position in the Pacific, but it also provided invaluable lessons that would influence military thinking for generations to come. The significance of the battle lay not just in its immediate military success, but in the way it demonstrated the importance of amphibious warfare, air superiority, and joint operations. As American forces transitioned from defensive warfare to offensive island-hopping campaigns, Iwo Jima was a crucial stepping stone in the broader strategy to reclaim the Pacific. The experience gained at Iwo Jima would shape the way U.S. forces would approach future conflicts, particularly in areas requiring complex coordination between air, sea, and ground forces. In the years following the battle, the lessons learned at Iwo Jima would be integrated into U.S. military doctrine. The Marine Corps would refine its amphibious assault tactics, applying the lessons of Iwo Jima's fortified positions and the need for effective coordination between naval bombardment, air support, and ground operations. The concept of precision strikes, honed during the battle, would influence future conflicts, including the Vietnam War and the Gulf War. The importance of airfields and forward bases, such as those established on Iwo Jima, would also be central to American military thinking in the decades to come. The U.S. Navy also emerged from the battle with a deeper understanding of the role of aircraft carriers and air superiority. The B-29 bombers, which had been refueled and launched from Iwo Jima's airfields, would go on to play a critical role in the eventual defeat of Japan. The American Navy would continue to invest in carrier-based aviation, solidifying the aircraft carrier as the cornerstone of the U.S. naval fleet in the post-war period. The long-term effects of the battle on American veterans. For the Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, the battle left scars that would last a lifetime. The physical and psychological toll of the battle was immense. Survivors of Iwo Jima carried not only the wounds of war but also the weight of the memories of their fallen comrades. The loss of over 6,800 Marines and the overwhelming brutality of the battle marked a significant turning point in the lives of the men who returned home. The battle's emotional and mental impact on veterans was profound. Many veterans experienced what would later be recognized as combat fatigue or post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The constant fighting, the loss of so many comrades, and the nightmarish conditions on the island led to deep psychological scars. Many veterans struggled to readjust to civilian life, haunted by memories of the Black Sands, the sounds of artillery, and the faces of fallen friends. While some veterans found peace through family, community, and support from fellow servicemen, many struggled in silence. The emotional toll was as severe as the physical wounds, and the impact of Iwo Jima remained a defining experience for those who fought there. For the surviving veterans, the battle would be a part of them for the rest of their lives, a chapter they would revisit in their thoughts, often without ever fully confronting the extent of the sacrifice made. How Iwo Jima played a pivotal role in the final stages of the Pacific War. While Iwo Jima was a brutal and costly battle, it played a crucial role in the final stages of the Pacific War. Once the island was captured, it provided the U.S. military with a strategic advantage that proved essential for the ultimate victory over Japan. The island's airfields allowed the B-29 Superfortress bombers to refuel and launch attacks on the Japanese homeland, significantly increasing the effectiveness of the American bombing campaign. The capture of Iwo Jima also provided a moral boost to the American public and military. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi, immortalized in photographs, became a symbol of American determination and resilience. It was a victory that marked the beginning of the end for Japan, as it signaled that no Japanese territory was beyond American reach. The successful seizure of Iwo Jima paved the way for future Allied operations in the Pacific, including the assault on Okinawa, which would bring American forces closer to Japan's home islands. In addition to its tactical value, the victory at Iwo Jima also served to dismantle Japan's naval power. The Japanese fleet was crippled after losing so many experienced pilots and sailors, which would leave Japan vulnerable to further Allied assaults. Iwo Jima was, in essence, the last defensive barrier before Japan's final defense in the home islands, and its fall marked the beginning of Japan's ultimate defeat in the Pacific. Reflective, the enduring impact of Iwo Jima on American military identity. The legacy of Iwo Jima continues to resonate in the U.S. military's strategies, the personal experiences of veterans, and the history of World War II. It remains a defining moment in American military history, a testament to the sacrifice, bravery, and resolve of those who fought and died on the island. The lessons learned on Iwo Jima shaped future wars and continue to influence military doctrine, making it not just a battle but a cornerstone of American identity in the modern era. As the battle for Iwo Jima raged on, one of the most striking and tragic aspects of the conflict was the Japanese refusal to surrender. Despite the overwhelming evidence that Iwo Jima was lost, the Japanese leadership, led by General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, continued to order his troops to fight to the death. For the Japanese defenders, surrender was not an option. It was a concept that stood in direct opposition to their Bushido code, which held that death in battle was more honorable than the shame of surrender. This refusal to accept defeat meant that the battle would be drawn out to its brutal conclusion, with Japanese forces continuing to hold their positions even as their numbers dwindled and their defenses crumbled. The refusal to surrender was not just an order from high command, it was also a national ethos that would cost the lives of thousands of Japanese soldiers. It was an unwillingness to face the reality that their empire was no longer capable of winning the war. How the Japanese leadership held on to the idea of fighting to the death. The Japanese leadership, particularly Kurabayashi, had made it clear to his men that they were to fight to the death. In the face of overwhelming American strength, it was a strategy of attrition and honor. Kurabayashi had written to his superiors before the battle, acknowledging that Iwo Jima's fall was inevitable, but insisting that the soldiers fight for as long as possible, to inflict as much damage as they could on the American forces. This idea of fighting until the last man was deeply embedded in the military culture of the time, and Kurabayashi's orders reflected a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable, even at the cost of his own men's lives. Kurabayashi's strategy was born of necessity and pride. He believed that by forcing the Americans to pay a high price for Iwo Jima, the island's defense would serve as a symbolic victory that could be used to rally the Japanese population and military. The Japanese believed that, through sacrificial defense, they could delay an American invasion of the home islands and, perhaps, change the course of the war. Victory would be defined not by holding the island, but by showing that Japan would never surrender. The refusal to surrender was driven by the idea of honor, that if Japan were to give up, it would lose its status as an imperial power. Kurabayashi and his men fought under the belief that surrender would mean the ultimate dishonor. To hold their positions and to die fighting was seen as a way to preserve Japan's pride. The tragic end for the Japanese defenders who had little hope of survival. The Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima had little hope of surviving the American onslaught. As the Marines and naval bombardments pushed deeper into the island, the Japanese were pushed into their underground tunnels and bunkers, waiting for the inevitable. Despite knowing the futility of their position, the defenders carried on fighting, believing that resisting until the end was their duty. As the final days of the battle approached, the defenders of Iwo Jima were reduced to a desperate few. Many of the Japanese soldiers had already been killed in fierce close-quarters combat, and bunker after bunker had been destroyed. Yet, still, they resisted. The idea of surrender was unthinkable, and so the Japanese soldiers continued to fight, some even after they had no real chance of stopping the American forces. In the final stages of the battle, only pockets of resistance remained. The American Marines pushed forward, clearing out each defensive position with relentless firepower. The Japanese soldiers, though few in number, continued to make their last stand, even as their chances of survival diminished by the hour. Japanese officers would often give their final orders, fight until the last bullet, the last breath. But the cost of such resistance was high, and, ultimately, the last defenders were either killed in combat or taken prisoner. The tragic irony of their resolve was that, despite their tenacity, their sacrifice could not prevent the inevitable fall of Iwo Jima. The defenders fought for honor, but the outcome was sealed from the moment the first American landing craft hit the shore. The cost of honor, it turned out, was the complete annihilation of the defending forces. Their fight, though valiant, only delayed the inevitable. Tragic inevitability, the futility of continued resistance. As the final pockets of resistance were wiped out, the Japanese surrender came too late to affect the outcome of the battle. The defenders of Iwo Jima had given everything, their lives, their honor, and their pride, but the result was not a defiant victory, but the destruction of an entire force. The refusal to surrender, while a demonstration of resolve and courage, was ultimately an act of futile defiance. For the Americans, the battle's end was not greeted with joy, but with the recognition that such a victory came at a terrible cost. The Marine Corps had achieved its objective, but at a staggering loss of life. And for the Japanese, their continued resistance was a tragic final stand, one that had led them only to the total destruction of their forces and their imperial pride. The events on Iwo Jima marked the end of Japan's ability to resist. Their empire was now on the brink of collapse. Their refusal to accept surrender, while embodying the spirit of their nation, had led them to a tragic conclusion. The battle would live on as a reminder of the unrelenting resolve that defined both sides in the Pacific War, but also the futility of endless resistance in the face of overwhelming force. In the years following the Battle of Iwo Jima, the island, now scarred and filled with memories of the fierce fighting, became a place of deep reflection and remembrance. For the surviving Marines, the battle for Iwo Jima remained etched in their memories as one of the most significant, yet traumatic, experiences of their lives. After the war, many veterans of Iwo Jima returned to the island, not to fight, but to honor the sacrifice made by those who didn't survive. It was an emotional pilgrimage, a way to revisit the past and try to understand the true cost of the battle that had defined so many of their lives. In 1945, after the conclusion of the battle, Iwo Jima was eventually designated as a military memorial, but it wasn't until years later that its significance was fully realized. As the war receded into history, the island began to be recognized not just as the site of a military victory, but as a symbol of sacrifice and honor for both the American and Japanese forces who fought there. The Marines who had survived the battle returned to Iwo Jima, now empty of Japanese defenders, to pay tribute to their fallen comrades. For these veterans, the Black Sands were no longer just a battlefield but a place of memory, a sacred site where they could come to terms with the ghosts of war. The preservation of the island as a military memorial. The importance of Iwo Jima's preservation as a military memorial grew as time passed. In 1968, the island was formally made a memorial site, ensuring that future generations could witness the legacy of the battle. The U.S. Marines Memorial on the island stands as a solemn reminder of the men who gave their lives there. The memorial, which features the famous flag-raising image of Marines planting the American flag atop Mount Suribachi, was a symbol not only of victory, but of the devastating cost of war. The island itself, marked by remnants of bunkers, trenches, and even remnants of planes, remains a place of deep reverence. It is a place where the history of Iwo Jima, with its devastating losses on both sides, is kept alive through the personal stories of the men who fought there and the memories of those who did not return. For many veterans who revisited the island, the journey was more than just a symbolic gesture. It was a final tribute, an attempt to understand and give meaning to the years spent in battle, and to find closure. Many returned to the island in groups, taking part in memorial services and reflecting on what the battle had meant for them personally. They walked along the same black sands, through the same spots where their comrades had died, and felt the weight of history in the silence of the island. The journey to understand the battle's true human cost. The true human cost of the battle for Iwo Jima wasn't something that could be easily measured. More than 6,800 American Marines were killed in action, and more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers died defending the island. The experience of combat was something that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. For many, returning to Iwo Jima wasn't just about honoring the fallen, it was about grappling with their own memories, coming to terms with what they had witnessed, and understanding the full extent of the sacrifice made by those who had fought beside them. Historians and scholars, too, made the journey to Iwo Jima to study the battle and its significance. They examined the tactics used by both sides, the strategic decisions made by Generals Kurabayashi and Smith, and the psychological toll of the island. For these researchers, the island was not just a military site, it was a place of profound historical significance, where the human experience of war could be studied in its rawest form. The memories of the men who fought there, both American and Japanese, became part of the larger narrative of World War II, a part of the shared story of humanity's endurance in the face of destruction. Reverent and reflective, a journey to the past. The return to Iwo Jima was a deeply emotional experience for all those involved. Whether it was veterans seeking closure, historians researching the significance of the battle, or visitors paying tribute to the fallen, the island served as a living memorial to the sacrifice and endurance of those who had fought there. For the veterans who had faced death on those black sands, Iwo Jima remained a place of reflection, where the memories of comrades lost and the ghosts of battle could be honored, and perhaps, finally understood. The Battle of Iwo Jima would not be simply remembered as a chapter in military history. It would become an iconic symbol of sacrifice, one that transcended the confines of the battle itself and became a permanent part of American collective memory. Following the battle, Iwo Jima's role as a critical victory in the Pacific War ensured that it would never fade from history. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi, captured in the now legendary photograph, would come to represent the spirit of the Marine Corps and the larger American fighting resolve during World War II. But it was the battle's emotional toll and the sacrifice made by countless individuals that would ultimately turn Iwo Jima into an enduring symbol of American military valor. In the years after the war, Iwo Jima was immortalized as a memorial. The U.S. Marine Corps Memorial in Washington, D.C., also known as the Iwo Jima Memorial, was dedicated in 1954. The image of the Marines raising the American flag atop Mount Suribachi became the iconic representation of the heroism, sacrifice, and victory that had defined the battle. The statue, which stands near Arlington Cemetery, serves as a powerful reminder of the cost of war and the human spirit that fought for victory. Veterans' reflections, how they carried their memories of the battle throughout their lives. For the veterans who fought on Iwo Jima, the battle would never be something they could simply leave behind. The ghosts of war followed them, even after the victory was achieved. The men who survived the brutal combat on the island carried the emotional weight of their experience with them for the rest of their lives. Many returned home to family, trying to reintegrate into civilian life, but found themselves haunted by the sights and sounds of battle. The names of fallen comrades, the moments of unimaginable bravery, and the fear and loss they had experienced never left them. Veterans would often gather at reunions and memorials to reconnect with others who had been through the same hell. These meetings allowed them to share their stories, to honor the men they had lost, and to find a sense of community that helped ease their emotional burdens. But even as they moved forward with their lives, the memories of Iwo Jima were a part of them. The emotional scars, the images of their comrades' sacrifice, and the brotherhood of that shared experience would be carried forward by the survivors, as they passed the stories of the battle down to future generations. The men of Iwo Jima often spoke of the brotherhood they had formed on the island, how they had fought side by side, knowing that each man's survival depended on the others. They remembered the courage of the men who had fallen in battle, and how the survivors carried their memories with them as they returned home. In interviews and books, these veterans shared their reflections, the pride they felt for the victory, but also the pain and sorrow that came with it. For many, the loss of friends and the brutal nature of combat left emotional scars that would take years, sometimes decades, to address. The psychological toll of the battle for Iwo Jima was as profound as the physical toll, and many veterans found solace in sharing their experiences with others who understood the weight of their memories. Iwo Jima as a symbol of sacrifice in American military history. The victory at Iwo Jima, though crucial to the overall success of the Pacific War, was not a victory without immense cost. The sacrifice of the Marines, the American Navy, and the Air Force defined the battle, making it a cornerstone of American military history. The Marines' heroism, the courage under fire, and the relentless push through the island's defenses became a symbol of the American spirit, undaunted, unyielding, and sacrificial. The images of Iwo Jima, from the flag raising to the memorials, cemented its place as a national symbol. Iwo Jima became not only a military victory but a symbol of the price of freedom. The Marines' victory on the island was a testament to their endurance and sacrifice, qualities that would become central to the identity of the U.S. Marine Corps. For the American people, Iwo Jima represented the cost of victory, a victory that was achieved not just through strategy and strength, but through the sheer will of men who gave everything for their country. Nostalgic remembrance, a story carried forward by the survivors. The legacy of Iwo Jima has endured, not just through the physical memorials and the iconic images of the flag raising, but through the stories of the veterans who fought there. For these men, Iwo Jima would always be a part of them, a part of their past, a part of their identity. The sacrifice of that battle became woven into the larger story of American military history, a story that continues to inspire generations. The remembrance of Iwo Jima is a reminder that even in victory, sacrifice is the price of freedom. The Battle of Iwo Jima, despite being over 70 years ago, continues to hold a powerful place in the collective memory of the American public, military history enthusiasts, and veterans. The legacy of the battle, along with its profound impact on both the American and Japanese sides, has been captured, studied, and explored in documentaries, films, and books. These works have not only ensured that the story of Iwo Jima is never forgotten but also allowed future generations to understand the emotional and physical sacrifices made by those who fought there. In the years following the war, Hollywood and documentary filmmakers began to take notice of the iconic moments and profound sacrifices at Iwo Jima. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi, immortalized in the famous photograph by Joe Rosenthal, became the centerpiece of American remembrance. As early as the 1940s, the battle and its symbolism began to emerge in post-war culture, and filmmakers sought to create a visual representation of those who fought there. The flag raising would later serve as the inspiration for some of the most iconic war films produced in Hollywood. How the battle was remembered and represented in post-war culture. The victory at Iwo Jima quickly became one of the most prominent examples of American military valor. It was seen as not only a tactical victory but also as a symbol of national resolve and sacrifice. The flag raising at Mount Suribachi came to represent the American spirit, a willingness to fight against the odds and to endure unimaginable hardship for a higher cause. The image, which became one of the most reproduced photographs in history, was used in a variety of media, from newspapers to war posters, and soon became an iconic symbol of victory. This iconic moment was revisited in the 2006 film Flags of Our Fathers, directed by Clint Eastwood, which depicted the personal stories of the 6 Marines involved in the flag raising. The film, based on the book by James Bradley, whose father was one of the flag raisers, explored not only the symbolic importance of the event but also the emotional and psychological toll the battle had on the men who lived through it. It humanized the sacrifice, showing how the victory at Iwo Jima was paid for by the loss of so many brave men. Another film, Letters from Iwo Jima, released in the same year by Clint Eastwood, told the story from the Japanese perspective. It focused on the experience of the Japanese defenders led by General Kurabayashi, giving a rare and thoughtful look at the motivations and struggles of those who fought for their country to the death. This approach gave the audience a broader understanding of the shared human cost of war, transcending national boundaries. The representation of Iwo Jima in these works of fiction and documentary helped shape the way Americans and Japanese would remember the battle, making it not just a military operation but a human story. The continued exploration of Iwo Jima's strategic significance. While much of the emotional weight of the battle comes from its sacrifice, the strategic importance of Iwo Jima was equally crucial. In retrospect, Iwo Jima is recognized as one of the most important battles of the Pacific War, primarily because it provided the U.S. military with a critical airfield from which American bombers could refuel before striking targets in Japan. The airfields on Iwo Jima played a crucial role in supporting the B-29 bombing raids over the Japanese home islands, which were key to the Allied war effort. The American conquest of Iwo Jima also provided a moral victory. It was a symbolic turning point in the war, showing the world that Japan's military dominance could be broken. The battle, although costly in terms of lives lost, served as a stepping stone that set the stage for the final Allied assault on Japan, including the pivotal battle for Okinawa. Many military historians and scholars continue to explore the strategic significance of Iwo Jima as part of the broader context of the Pacific Campaign. It marked the shift from a defensive strategy on Japan's part to an offensive one for the United States. Iwo Jima was no longer just about gaining control of an island, it was about gaining the upper hand in the global struggle for dominance. Lasting legacy. The myth of Iwo Jima in modern culture. The myth of Iwo Jima, built from its iconic flag raising and the sacrifices made by the men who fought there, continues to shape modern culture. The battle's representation in films, books, and documentaries ensures that its lessons, struggles, and the human toll of war will never be forgotten. Iwo Jima's legacy continues to resonate with veterans, historians, and the American public, as it remains an essential part of the collective memory of World War II. The capture of Mount Suribachi, the highest point on Iwo Jima, would come to symbolize the turning of the tide in the battle. The mountain was strategically critical, offering the Japanese defenders a clear view of the island's expanse, making it a crucial piece of the island's defense. Control of Suribachi would grant the Marines a vital advantage, allowing them to observe and control the movements of the remaining Japanese forces scattered across the island. From the moment the Marines hit the beaches, Mount Suribachi became the ultimate objective, and its capture marked the beginning of a significant shift in the battle. The Japanese forces, entrenched in and around the summit, understood the mountain's strategic value. They had fortified the area with bunkers, artillery, and machine gun positions, prepared to defend it to the last man. For them, Suribachi was not just a tactical high ground, it was the heart of the island's defense. Its fall would signal the beginning of the end for their control over the island. Despite knowing this, the Japanese soldiers fought desperately, determined to deny the Americans this critical victory. Stories of bravery from the Marines fighting to capture the peak. The Marines, many of whom had already experienced brutal combat in the Pacific, knew that taking Mount Suribachi would not be an easy feat. As they made their way up the rugged slopes of the mountain, the fierce resistance from the Japanese defenders became immediately apparent. The Marines faced a barrage of gunfire, artillery shelling, and grenades from well-established defensive positions. Amidst the chaos, countless stories of individual bravery emerged. One Marine, Corporal Harlan Block, was part of the group that would eventually raise the flag atop Suribachi. During the assault, Block displayed extraordinary courage and selflessness, leading his men up the mountain even under heavy fire. His actions, along with those of many others, would become part of the story of Iwo Jima, stories that were both heroic and tragic, as many of the Marines who fought there would not survive. One of the most remarkable stories came from Private First Class Franklin Sousley, who was one of the 6 men involved in the famous flag raising. Sousley, along with his comrades, had fought for days to take the summit, enduring continuous enemy resistance. After reaching the top, he participated in a moment that would become immortalized in history, the raising of the American flag. Sousley's bravery was echoed by many others who scaled the slopes of Mount Suribachi, proving that the victory was not won by one man alone, but by the collective effort and sacrifice of many. Despite the grueling fight and the dangers that surrounded them, the Marines pushed on with determination. Every step taken was hard-won, each inch gained representing the courage and resolve of the men determined to plant the flag on that mountain. The importance of the flag raising on Suribachi and its symbolic meaning for the soldiers. When the flag was finally raised on the summit of Mount Suribachi, it was more than just a military objective achieved. It became a powerful symbol for the Marines, for the American public, and for the world. The image of the flag raising, captured by Joe Rosenthal, would become one of the most iconic photographs of World War II, representing not just victory, but the spirit of sacrifice that had defined the battle. For the Marines on the island, the flag raising provided an emotional boost. It was a moment of triumph amidst the overwhelming chaos and the horrific conditions of battle. The sight of the flag, an emblem of American resolve, signified that they had, indeed, conquered the island's most formidable position. For many, it was a reminder that despite the incredible toll of the battle, the American forces had not only overcome the physical challenges of Iwo Jima but had also defeated the Japanese belief in invincibility. The flag raising was not only a symbolic victory but also a tangible proof that the Marines could achieve their objectives, no matter how difficult. While the battle was far from over, the moment served as a reminder that the Americans could, and would, overcome the challenges set before them. However, the symbolic meaning of the flag raising also came with a complex undercurrent. For the Marines who had fought their way up the mountain, the raising of the flag was not a victory without cost. The loss of so many friends and comrades on the island hung heavy in their minds. The flag represented victory, yes, but it also represented the sacrifice of those who had died along the way. The American flag was both a sign of unity and a reminder of the terrible price paid to win the island. For the men who raised it, the victory was bittersweet, for they knew that Iwo Jima's true cost would not be fully realized until much later. Still, the raising of the flag stood as a moment of hope, a beacon that would carry the Marines forward through the final days of the battle. Courage under fire, the mountain as a beacon of victory. The struggle for Mount Suribachi was a test of courage, perseverance, and determination. The Marines faced fierce resistance, but their bravery in the face of impossible odds became the hallmark of Iwo Jima. The flag raising at Suribachi, while symbolic, represented the sacrifice and resolve of every man who fought there, and it would remain an enduring symbol of victory for years to come. The U.S. Marine Corps played a pivotal and indispensable role in the invasion of Iwo Jima, a battle that would come to define the Marine Corps' identity in the years that followed. The Marine Corps had a storied history in the Pacific theater, and their role in Iwo Jima, despite the tremendous losses, would be remembered as a testament to their determination, resolve, and unwavering commitment to the mission. From the moment the first Marines landed on the black sands of Iwo Jima, they knew they were about to face a battle unlike any they had encountered before. The Japanese defenders, entrenched deeply in the island's underground fortifications, were ready to make the cost of victory extremely high. But the Marines, accustomed to island-hopping campaigns and fierce resistance, faced these odds with the same spirit that had carried them through previous battles. Iwo Jima would test their mettle more than any previous engagement, but the Marines understood that their role was not just to secure an island, it was to secure the American victory in the Pacific. Tactics and challenges faced by the Marines in the relentless battle. The tactics employed by the U.S. Marines in the battle for Iwo Jima were shaped by the lessons learned from earlier island invasions in the Pacific, but Iwo Jima was a unique and exceptionally difficult challenge. The island was heavily fortified, with Japanese soldiers concealed in underground tunnels, caves, and bunkers that made every corner of the island a potential trap. the Marines faced ferocious, tenacious resistance, with Japanese forces launching surprise attacks from hidden positions. It was clear from the outset that the battle would not be over quickly, and the Marines would have to fight for every inch of ground they gained. The initial stages of the invasion saw the Marines relying heavily on artillery support and naval bombardment to soften the island's defenses. The U.S. Navy provided close fire support, shelling Japanese positions from offshore. Airstrikes from carrier-based planes attempted to weaken the enemy further, but the nature of the Japanese fortifications, deeply entrenched and well camouflaged, rendered these tactics partially ineffective. The Japanese resistance was too well prepared, and the Marines had to adapt their approach. As they advanced across the island, the Marines were forced to clear the island inch by inch, moving slowly through the volcanic ash and rubble, taking each position one at a time. It was a battle of attrition, with the Marines using flamethrowers, grenades, and bayonets to eliminate enemy positions, while still advancing under heavy fire. The terrain, difficult and treacherous, made movement slow, while the constant artillery and mortar fire from the Japanese created a near-constant threat of death. Every step the Marines took forward was costly, but they pressed on. The challenge of underground combat was particularly daunting. Many of the Japanese soldiers were hidden in well-fortified tunnels, which made it difficult for the Marines to locate and neutralize them. The Japanese forces employed snipers who would fire from hidden positions, disappearing back into the island's labyrinth. The Marines had to learn to adapt quickly to this new kind of warfare, using tactics that involved flushing out enemies and clearing positions systematically. The heavy emotional and physical toll on the Marines as they fought through the island's defenses. The emotional and physical toll on the U.S. Marines during the battle was immense. The conditions of Iwo Jima were brutal. The men were exposed to constant shelling, the blistering heat, and the suffocating volcanic ash that covered the island. The constant noise of artillery and machine gun fire created an atmosphere of chaos and exhaustion, making it difficult for the Marines to stay focused on anything other than their immediate survival. As the days dragged on, the emotional strain of the battle became more apparent. The Marines had come to the island prepared for a grueling fight, but they had not anticipated the extent of the resistance they would encounter. They knew that each day would bring them closer to victory, but they also understood that every day would cost them more men, more friends, and more comrades. For many Marines, the loss of close friends on the battlefield was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the battle. In the close-quarters combat, there were few places to hide, and death was often sudden and unexpected. Marines fought side by side, and each loss felt like a personal blow. The constant exposure to death, combined with the relentless resistance from the Japanese, created an emotional burden that weighed heavily on every Marine. Unyielding resolve, the persistence of the Marines in the face of overwhelming odds. The Marines' determination and resolve were tested at every turn. The battle for Iwo Jima became a fight for survival, where each step taken forward came at an incredible cost. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Marines continued to push forward, driven by their sense of duty and their commitment to their brothers in arms. The persistence of the Marines, their unyielding resolve, and their ability to adapt to the constant challenges of the island became the defining traits of their success. As the battle for Iwo Jima continued into its final stages, the Japanese defenders, under the leadership of General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, remained unyielding in their commitment to resist the American advance. Though the tide of battle had long since turned against them, and the inevitable loss of the island loomed large, the defenders fought on with a resolve that would come to be remembered as one of the most tragic yet heroic aspects of the battle. Kurabayashi's defensive strategy was rooted in a belief that Iwo Jima, though strategically important, was ultimately a symbolic last stand for Japan. His forces, deeply entrenched in the island's underground tunnels and bunkers, refused to surrender. Kurabayashi had prepared his troops to fight not just for the island, but for the honor of their emperor and their nation. He had studied previous battles and knew the importance of preventing the Americans from achieving a quick victory. The defense of Iwo Jima was not about holding the island at all costs, but about making the Americans pay a high price for each inch they gained. The intent was to cause maximum casualties, delay the American advance, and, perhaps, force the U.S. into negotiations or at least prolong the war. The Japanese defense, built into the island's natural terrain, relied heavily on the use of underground positions. The island was dotted with hidden caves, tunnels, and bunkers that allowed the defenders to remain well concealed from American bombardment. These underground fortifications allowed the Japanese to reposition, surprise the advancing Marines, and continue to fight with deadly efficiency even as the island's outer defenses were overrun. As the Marines advanced, they would clear one bunker only to be met by another hidden deep within the island. The final days of the battle, where many Japanese soldiers fought to the death in caves and bunkers. As the Marines advanced deeper into Iwo Jima, the Japanese defense slowly began to disintegrate. But the defenders, despite being outnumbered and surrounded, continued to resist at all costs. By the final days of the battle, the Japanese forces had been reduced to small pockets of resistance hidden in the island's caves and bunkers. With few resources and no hope of reinforcement, the Japanese soldiers fought on with the understanding that their survival was impossible. Many of the remaining defenders knew that surrender was not an option. Kurabayashi's orders had been clear: they were to fight until the last man, refusing to yield. The Japanese soldiers, despite their dwindling numbers, showed an unyielding commitment to their mission. These men, knowing they would never leave the island alive, fought not just for survival but for a cause they believed in. They fought because it was their duty and their honor to do so. The fighting in the final days of the battle became increasingly desperate. The Marines, though victorious in their strategy, faced unrelenting counterattacks. The Japanese soldiers, hiding in caves, launched surprise assaults using grenades, bayonets, and rifles in one final effort to inflict as much damage as possible. The Marines would clear one position only to find another. These last defenders, isolated and surrounded, continued to fight with ferocity, determined to follow their orders until the bitter end. For many, this last stand was their only remaining act of honor. Admiral Kurabayashi's leadership and the strength of the Japanese will to defend the island. Admiral Tadamaki Kurabayashi was the leader who embodied the spirit of resistance. Understanding that Japan could not win the battle, his mission became one of delaying the inevitable and inflicting heavy losses on the Americans. He had carefully prepared his troops for the defense of the island, and his leadership was a model of stoic determination. Kurabayashi's decision to fortify the island with underground positions was pivotal to the Japanese defense strategy. He knew that traditional defensive tactics, such as massed frontal assaults, would not suffice against the overwhelming firepower of the American forces. Instead, he chose to dissolve his forces into the island, making the Marines' advance not only physically difficult, but mentally exhausting. The Japanese soldiers under his command, despite facing overwhelming odds, continued to follow his orders and resisted the American forces with a determination that would lead them to fight to their deaths. In a sense, Kurabayashi's leadership represented the cost of honor and duty, a tragic heroism in the face of a lost cause. His soldiers, inspired by his resolve, fought on, despite knowing they could never win the battle. For many Japanese soldiers, the battle was not only about defending Iwo Jima, it was about fulfilling their duty and maintaining their honor until the end. Tragic heroism, the loss of hope but not spirit. The resistance at Iwo Jima, particularly in its final days, was marked by a heroic resolve that, while ultimately futile, demonstrated the incredible strength of the human spirit. The Japanese defenders knew that the battle was lost, but they fought to the very end, driven by a sense of duty, honor, and loyalty to their country. Though their efforts were in vain, the determination and courage they displayed under overwhelming odds stand as a tragic testament to the high cost of war, where honor and sacrifice often collide with the brutality of reality. The battle for Iwo Jima was one of the most costly confrontations of World War II. By the time the fighting ceased on March 26, 1945, more than 6,800 American Marines and over 20,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed. The island, once a strategic outpost, was now a vast cemetery, its black sands stained with the blood of those who fought for its control. The Americans had emerged victorious, but the cost of that victory was a stark reminder of the brutality of war and the sacrifice demanded of all those involved. For the U.S. Marines, the battle for Iwo Jima marked the culmination of a grueling and costly campaign in the Pacific. Despite overwhelming firepower, air superiority, and naval support, the Marines faced relentless resistance from Japanese defenders who fought with fanatical resolve. The cost of securing the island was steep. Marines were lost in close-quarters combat, artillery strikes, and mortars, each death leaving a ripple effect on the broader Marine Corps and on the families and friends left behind. On the Japanese side, the casualty rate was even more staggering. Out of an estimated 21,000 Japanese soldiers, only about 1,000 survived the battle. The rest either perished in battle or, adhering to their orders, chose to die in the defense of the island. The Japanese leadership had ordered the defenders to fight to the death, and they did so with unflinching determination. The loss of life, on both sides, was not just a measure of military loss, but of human cost, lives taken in the name of duty, honor, and empire. Personal stories of sacrifice from Marines and Japanese soldiers who gave their lives. Behind the staggering numbers of casualties were the personal stories of sacrifice, individual Marines and Japanese soldiers who gave their lives in the service of their comrades and their countries. These stories were often those of extraordinary bravery and selflessness. One of the most poignant stories was that of Private First Class Jacqueline H. Lucas, who, despite being severely wounded, threw himself on a grenade to save his comrades. His actions would later earn him the Medal of Honor, but for Lucas and many others, such acts were driven not by a desire for recognition, but by the fierce bond of brotherhood and a commitment to the men fighting alongside him. Many Marines, like Lucas, never returned home, their names etched into the battle's history, their sacrifices immortalized in the stories of those who survived. On the Japanese side, there were also stories of personal sacrifice and heroism, albeit in the context of a lost cause. Many Japanese soldiers fought with incredible tenacity, determined to uphold their honor even as the situation became more desperate. Private First Class Shoichi Shimomura, a member of the Imperial Army, was one of many who refused to surrender, continuing to fight even after the island's fate had already been sealed. His story, and that of others like him, is one of tragic loyalty, the belief that their sacrifice would serve a higher purpose, even if it meant certain death. These personal sacrifices, whether on the American or Japanese side, represent the ultimate cost of victory, the lives of those who gave everything for a cause they believed in. For the Marines, it was their dedication to their country and their fellow soldiers that carried them through one of the most brutal battles in the Pacific. For the Japanese defenders, it was their loyalty to the Emperor and their commitment to die fighting that defined their resistance. Reflections on the true cost of victory, both military and human. The true cost of victory on Iwo Jima can never be fully measured by the numbers alone. The statistics, the tens of thousands of casualties, are only a part of the story. The emotional and psychological toll on those who fought there, on both sides, was just as profound. For the U.S. Marines, the battle for Iwo Jima was a defining experience. Many of the men who fought there would never be the same after the battle. The sights, the sounds, the smell of death, they would stay with the survivors long after the battle had ended. For the Japanese defenders, the cost was equally tragic. They fought not for territory or personal gain, but for honor and loyalty to their emperor. And yet, despite their determination and sacrifice, their efforts were ultimately in vain. The refusal to surrender led them to face almost total annihilation, and in the end, their sacrifice was swallowed up by the inexorable advance of the American war machine. The final days of the battle were filled with the sounds of suicide, the ultimate act of defiance in the face of hopelessness. The price of victory at Iwo Jima was not just in the lives lost but in the human cost of war. It was a victory that, while necessary for the final defeat of Japan, was not easily celebrated. The Marines, having fought through unimaginable adversity, would later reflect on the battle as one of triumph and tragedy, a battle that had cost them dearly, but one that had ultimately paved the way for the end of the war in the Pacific. Somber recognition, the true toll of battle on all involved. The battle for Iwo Jima, while a military victory, left a deep scar on both the American and Japanese forces. The sacrifice made by both sides in the pursuit of victory was immense. In the end, the battle serves as a reminder that victory in war often comes at an overwhelming cost. Human lives, bravery, and sacrifice are always the price paid. The battle's legacy continues to shape how we understand the human cost of conflict, reminding us of the price of freedom and the immense courage required to achieve it. The Battle of Iwo Jima would become more than just one of the many engagements in the Pacific theater of World War II. It would come to symbolize the cost of war, the sacrifice of the soldiers who fought there, and the resolve of a nation determined to secure victory at any cost. The battle's significance, not only militarily but also symbolically, would be cemented in the collective memory of the American public and military. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi, captured in the iconic photograph, would become one of the most powerful images of the war, representing the American spirit, determination, and the cost of freedom. The symbolism of Iwo Jima is immense, and its place in history is undeniable. The sacrifice of the Marines who fought and died there would serve as a touchstone for the American identity, embodying the resilience and courage that marked the American war effort in the Pacific. Though the island was small, the battle for Iwo Jima would have profound implications, not just in the military context, but in the shaping of national morale and the understanding of war. The role of Iwo Jima in the final push towards Japan's defeat. Iwo Jima's role in the final stages of the Pacific War cannot be overstated. The island's strategic importance as a forward base for American bombers, particularly the B-29 superfortresses, was vital for the Allied campaign against Japan's home islands. The capture of Iwo Jima provided the U.S. with a critical refueling station, allowing American bombers to reach Japan more effectively. Prior to Iwo Jima, long-range bombing raids required extensive detours, limiting the number of missions that could be carried out. The island's airfields would allow for direct, efficient strikes on the Japanese homeland, accelerating the final push towards Japan's ultimate defeat. Additionally, the fall of Iwo Jima dealt a psychological blow to Japan, shattering the myth of their invincibility and demonstrating that no Japanese territory was beyond reach. The capture of Iwo Jima was a clear signal to the Japanese leadership that their defense perimeter was collapsing. The island became a symbol of Japan's shrinking hold on the Pacific, and its fall opened the way for the invasion of Okinawa, another crucial step toward the end of the war. Iwo Jima's importance extended far beyond its immediate military utility. The battle itself served as a moral victory, providing a crucial morale boost to both the American public and the U.S. military. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi became a lasting symbol of hope and victory, reinforcing the belief that despite the brutal nature of the conflict, the Allied forces were determined to win the war. The island's historical significance in American military history. Iwo Jima's legacy in American military history is profound. It is not just remembered for the tactical success that allowed the United States to secure an important base in the Pacific, but also for its symbolic role in the identity of the U.S. Marine Corps. The Marines' performance on Iwo Jima became a benchmark for their resolve and effectiveness in combat. It demonstrated the Marine Corps' ability to carry out some of the most difficult and costly assaults under the most extreme conditions. The battle's ferocity and the selflessness displayed by the Marines are still considered core components of the Marine Corps ethos. The Battle of Iwo Jima was also a turning point for American military doctrine. The need for effective coordination between air, sea, and ground forces became evident as the Marines encountered fierce resistance from entrenched Japanese defenders. The lessons learned in amphibious assault tactics, air-ground coordination, and strategic resource management would be integrated into future American military operations, especially in later conflicts like the Vietnam War and Gulf War. Legacy and reflection: Iwo Jima as a cornerstone of military history. Iwo Jima is a cornerstone of military history, not just for the strategic victories it enabled, but for the sacrifices and lessons it represents. The legacy of Iwo Jima continues to be a defining element of American military identity, representing the high price of victory and the indomitable spirit of those who fought there. The flag raising, the sacrifice of the Marines, and the symbolic power of the island as a turning point in the Pacific War ensure that the battle will forever be remembered as one of the most significant events in American military. The Iwo Jima Memorial, located just outside Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., stands as one of the most iconic symbols of military honor and sacrifice in American history. Dedicated on November 10, 1954, the memorial immortalizes the flag raising on Mount Suribachi, an image that has come to define the spirit and resolve of the U.S. Marine Corps and the sacrifice made during the battle for Iwo Jima. The creation of the memorial was not just a tribute to the Marines who fought on that island, but also an effort to ensure that the legacy of their actions would be remembered for generations to come. The flag-raising image, captured by photographer Joe Rosenthal, would become the central image of the memorial. The powerful moment, where 6 Marines raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi, symbolized not just the military victory at Iwo Jima but also the sacrifice of the men who had fought there. It captured the essence of American resolve and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The photograph, and later the memorial, served as a reminder of what the Marines endured, the tremendous sacrifices they made, and how their courage would be etched in history. The enduring legacy of the battle in American culture and its role in future wars. The creation of the Iwo Jima Memorial ensured that the battle's legacy would be preserved not only for the men who fought there but for future generations who might never fully grasp the brutality and sacrifice that defined Iwo Jima. The battle for the island, and particularly the flag raising, became a symbol of courage, a reminder of the cost of victory, and a reflection of the American spirit during World War II. In the years following its dedication, the Iwo Jima Memorial became a central point of remembrance for military veterans, particularly the U.S. Marine Corps, who revered the image of the flag raising as a reminder of their sacrifice and their duty. It became a symbol not only for the Marines but for all members of the armed forces, representing the shared sacrifice that military personnel experience in times of war. The memorial also played an important role in later conflicts, where the legacy of Iwo Jima would continue to inspire and motivate Marines in future wars, including the Vietnam War and the Gulf War. The valor and tenacity of the Marines at Iwo Jima set a high standard for future generations of military personnel, reminding them of the price of freedom and the sacrifices required to secure it. In moments of crisis, the men and women of the military could look to the Iwo Jima Memorial as a symbol of the strength and resolve that the U.S. military would continue to draw upon. The memorial's place in Washington, D.C., becoming a symbol of military honor and sacrifice. Standing tall in Arlington, the Iwo Jima Memorial has become a central feature of American military heritage. It is a place where veterans, families, and visitors alike gather to reflect on the sacrifices of the men who fought there, as well as the broader sacrifices made by all those who served in the military. The location, near the hallowed grounds of Arlington National Cemetery, serves as a powerful reminder of the cost of war and the honor of those who serve their country. For many veterans, the Iwo Jima Memorial is a sacred place of remembrance. For the families of those who died at Iwo Jima, it is a place to mourn, to honor, and to ensure that the memory of their loved ones is preserved. The image of the flag raising is so ingrained in the American consciousness that it is often the first symbol of military sacrifice that comes to mind. The memorial's place in Washington, D.C. has made it a national treasure, a place where Americans from all walks of life can come together to honor the sacrifices of those who fought for freedom. The annual ceremonies and memorial services held at the memorial continue to draw large crowds, especially on Veterans Day and Marine Corps Birthday. These events serve as a reminder of the lasting legacy of the men who fought on Iwo Jima and the enduring sacrifice of the U.S. military. For the American public, the memorial has become not just a place of reflection, but also a symbol of the strength and unity that defines the nation. Reverence, the ongoing reverence for those who fought and died at Iwo Jima. The Iwo Jima Memorial stands as a permanent and enduring symbol of the sacrifice, honor, and resolve of the U.S. Marines and all those who served during World War II. It represents the spirit of unity, of selflessness, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for the greater good. Through its towering figure and iconic image, it continues to inspire future generations, reminding all who visit of the high cost of freedom and the profound importance of remembering those who gave their lives to secure it. The veterans who fought at Iwo Jima carried the weight of their experiences for the rest of their lives. For many, the battle was more than just a chapter in their military service, it was a life-defining event, shaping their identities, their relationships, and their perspectives on life. Years after the battle, veterans of Iwo Jima would reflect on the personal sacrifices made, the friends lost, and the grueling realities of combat that would continue to affect them long after the war ended. In interviews, many veterans spoke of how Iwo Jima was unlike any battle they had faced before. The intensity of the fighting, the overwhelming losses, and the relentless Japanese defense left an indelible mark on those who survived. While they had entered the battle as young men, many would leave the island as changed individuals, carrying scars both visible and invisible. For those who survived, the memories of Iwo Jima would haunt them in the years that followed. Veterans often recalled the horror of seeing comrades fall, the constant feeling of being under fire, and the overwhelming fear that gripped them as they faced an enemy that would not yield. These experiences shaped their views on war, on sacrifice, and on the true cost of victory. The battle, in many ways, was beyond comprehension for those who fought it. Despite all their training, the Marines faced something they had never expected, an enemy determined to fight to the death, an island filled with fortified positions, and a constant barrage of fire that made every step forward feel like a grind against fate. For many of the survivors, the battle was an endurance test, not only of their physical limits but of their mental resilience. How veterans coped with the horrors of war and carried those memories forward. The psychological toll of Iwo Jima was one that many veterans would carry long after the battle had ended. The horrors of close-quarters combat, the bitter loss of close friends, and the overwhelming sense of fear during the battle were not easily forgotten. Many veterans struggled to reconcile the brutality of war with their post-war lives, finding it difficult to express their feelings or discuss their memories with loved ones who could never fully understand what they had been through. Some veterans turned to reunions and veterans organizations to find solace. These gatherings became vital spaces where survivors could connect with others who had shared similar experiences. Shared memories of Iwo Jima became a way for these men to keep their connection to the battle alive. Through these interactions, they were able to express the pain of loss, the confusion, and the honor that had come from the battle. The camaraderie formed on the island was not easily replaced, and the veterans of Iwo Jima often found comfort in knowing they were not alone in carrying the weight of their experiences. Yet, for others, the struggle to cope with the emotional and psychological effects of the battle was not so easy. Many veterans found themselves battling post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a condition that was not widely understood at the time but that would later be recognized as a significant challenge for many returning soldiers. For some, the memories of Iwo Jima would stay with them, resurfacing in dreams, flashbacks, and a deep sense of sadness and loss. The battle had taken a heavy toll, and many veterans spent years processing their experiences, working through feelings of guilt, grief, and survivor's remorse. The emotional scars of the battle would be carried in silence, only gradually being acknowledged and shared as more veterans began to open up in the decades following the war. The emotional and psychological cost of war borne by the survivors. The psychological scars of Iwo Jima were not just personal, but societal. The survivors returned home to a world that had largely moved on from the war, and for many, reintegrating into civilian life was an intense struggle. Many veterans found it difficult to explain their experiences or to share their emotions with family and friends who couldn't understand the trauma they had witnessed. The disconnect between the horrors of Iwo Jima and the relative peace of post-war America was striking. Despite the emotional burden, many veterans carried forward the lessons of sacrifice and honor that they had learned on the island. While some turned inward, others found ways to channel their experiences into efforts to preserve the legacy of Iwo Jima. They sought to ensure that future generations would understand the cost of war and the sacrifices made by the men who fought and died on the Black Sands. The creation of memorials, the dedication of museums, and the sharing of stories in books, films, and documentaries helped to honor the memories of those who didn't return home and gave survivors a way to cope with their shared trauma. Yet, even as these veterans worked to ensure that their experiences were remembered, they remained forever marked by the battle. The mental scars left by Iwo Jima, whether in the form of nightmares, flashbacks, or quiet moments of reflection, were a constant reminder that the cost of victory was more than the lives lost. It was also the emotional toll of war, the haunting reality of how battle shapes the soul. Reflective, the weight of sacrifice and the passage of time. The veterans of Iwo Jima carried the weight of the battle with them throughout their lives. The sacrifices made on that island, and the emotional toll of war, were not easily forgotten. Their reflections, shared in interviews, memoirs, and personal accounts, reveal the profound impact that Iwo Jima had on their lives. The survivors continue to live with the memories of the men who fought beside them, the honor of their service, and the cost of war, both on the battlefield and in the hearts of those who live to tell the story. The island of Iwo Jima, once a battlefield soaked with the blood of thousands, has since been preserved as a memorial to those who fought and died there. Today, it stands as a silent witness to the sacrifices made by both the U.S. Marines and the Japanese defenders. The Iwo Jima Memorial, located in Washington, D.C., is the most visible tribute to the island's importance, but the island itself remains a hallowed ground, its terrain marked by the physical remnants of the battle and the memories of those who fought on its black sands. In the years following the battle, Iwo Jima was designated as a military memorial site in recognition of the sacrifices made there. The island, though not heavily populated, became a site of pilgrimage for veterans, families, and historians who wished to pay their respects to those who gave everything for victory. Iwo Jima, with its rugged landscape and solemn atmosphere, serves as a place for reflection, where the stories of valor and sacrifice are not just remembered but honored. The U.S. government, alongside various veterans organizations, worked to ensure that the island would be preserved as a living testament to the events of February and March 1945. The memorials and monuments on the island serve not only as reminders of the American victory but also as tributes to the bravery and sacrifice of all those involved. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi is forever etched into the island's history, but the memory of the fallen soldiers, both American and Japanese, endures in the quiet echoes of the land. The quiet island, now a site of reflection, where the echoes of battle still linger. Though the battle for Iwo Jima ended long ago, the echoes of battle still resonate on the island. The island's black sands, once soaked in blood, have settled into an eerie stillness, but beneath the surface lies the history of the battle, now a silent witness to time. Walking through the island today, one can see the remnants of old Japanese bunkers, scattered artillery positions, and shell-pocked cliffs, each serving as a reminder of the brutality and sacrifice of that fateful campaign. The island, though now a peaceful place, still carries with it the weight of history. For those who visit, particularly veterans and their families, Iwo Jima is a site of deep reverence, where the past is felt in every step, in every corner of the landscape. The physical scars of the battle remain, visible in the bunkers and tunnels that still dot the island. The sound of battle may have long faded, but the memory of it lingers in the air, in the soil, and in the hearts of those who fought there. The quiet island has, over time, become a reflection of the passage of time, allowing visitors to meditate on the sacrifices made by the men who fought there. For veterans, it is a place to honor the fallen and remember their brothers in arms. For younger generations, it is a place to learn about the costs of war and the enduring human spirit that rises in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The island is a living testament to the courage, sacrifice, and humanity of the men who fought there. Iwo Jima, while largely unchanged in its ruggedness and harsh beauty, has become a living testament to the courage, sacrifice, and humanity of the men who fought there. The survivors of Iwo Jima, along with the families of those who perished, returned to the island to reflect on the past, honoring the lives of those who sacrificed everything. The island has become a place where the memory of Iwo Jima is kept alive, a symbol not only of military victory but of the costs that accompany it. Each year, veterans, their families, and the American public gather to commemorate the battle at Iwo Jima memorial services, continuing to honor the lives lost and the experiences of those who lived through the battle. The sacrifice of those who fought on the island is now an integral part of the American identity, a reminder of the courage it takes to defend one's beliefs, country, and ideals. The island's legacy is not just military, it is deeply human. It is a place where visitors can see the bravery of both the U.S. Marines and the Japanese defenders, each fighting for their respective causes. The echoes of their struggles, their sacrifices, and their humanity still reverberate, giving future generations an opportunity to reflect on the costs of war and the enduring lessons of the past. Poignant stillness, the island is a silent witness to the passage of time. The island of Iwo Jima is a solemn and enduring symbol of the sacrifice made during one of the Pacific War's most intense battles. The memories of the men who fought there continue to live on through the island's remembrance. As a memorial site, Iwo Jima stands as a silent witness to time, carrying the weight of history, while offering reflection and understanding for those who visit. It is not just an island, but a symbol of the human spirit, forever linked to the sacrifice made by those who fought and died there. The Battle of Iwo Jima played a pivotal role in the larger context of the Pacific War, representing a crucial step toward the final defeat of Japan. While the island itself was relatively small in terms of size, its strategic significance was immense. The capture of Iwo Jima allowed the United States to secure a key foothold in the Pacific, providing a vital launching pad for further Allied operations and making the invasion of Japan's home islands a distinct possibility. Iwo Jima's importance extended beyond its immediate military value. It became a symbol of American determination and a key to unlocking the final stages of the Pacific conflict. How the battle contributed to the Allied victory in the Pacific and accelerated the war's conclusion. The capture of Iwo Jima had an immediate impact on the Allied war effort in the Pacific. The island's airfields provided a critical base for American bombers, particularly the B-29 superfortresses, which were used to strike Japan's industrial and military centers. These long-range bombers had previously been restricted by the range limitations of their fuel, but the airfields on Iwo Jima allowed for refueling, enabling them to carry out more devastating attacks on the Japanese homeland. With the island under American control, the Allied forces gained the upper hand in the air campaign over Japan. The island's strategic importance as a refueling base for bombers played a key role in accelerating the American bombing campaign, which contributed significantly to the weakening of Japan's industrial capacity and military infrastructure. By cutting off Japan's ability to sustain its military, the capture of Iwo Jima helped shorten the war, bringing Japan closer to total surrender. Additionally, the battle for Iwo Jima had a significant psychological impact on both the Japanese and the American forces. The American victory on the island dealt a blow to Japanese morale, signaling that no part of their empire was beyond reach. For the Japanese leadership, the loss of Iwo Jima, combined with the ongoing Allied offensive, made it increasingly clear that victory was no longer possible. The island's fall was a critical turning point, demonstrating the vulnerability of Japan's defensive perimeter and making the eventual invasion of the Japanese home islands an inevitable conclusion. The strategic importance of the island and the American victory that paved the way for Japan's final defeat. Iwo Jima's strategic location, roughly 650 miles from Tokyo, made it a crucial outpost in the final stages of the Pacific War. The capture of the island was not simply a tactical victory, it was a strategic necessity. With Iwo Jima in Allied hands, the United States could now stage direct bombing raids against Japan's mainland, putting even more pressure on the Japanese government to surrender. The island's airfields provided an uninterrupted supply line for B-29 bombers, greatly improving the efficiency and effectiveness of bombing runs on Japanese cities and military targets. The Americans also used Iwo Jima as a base for launching fighter aircraft to provide escort for bombers, ensuring the success of long-range strikes. Additionally, Iwo Jima's capture provided a base for the U.S. Navy to launch further operations in the Pacific, contributing to the broader effort to secure control over the Pacific Ocean. The success at Iwo Jima also paved the way for the invasion of Okinawa, which would serve as the next critical step in the American strategy to invade Japan's home islands. Both Iwo Jima and Okinawa were part of the final assault on Japan, positioning the Allies to stage an invasion that would ultimately lead to the war's conclusion. The strategic importance of Iwo Jima was clear. It not only protected American bombers but also served as a critical stepping stone toward the final push into Japan itself. Strategic overview: the vital role of Iwo Jima in the broader war effort. In the larger narrative of the Pacific War, Iwo Jima stands as a vital link in the chain of events that led to Japan's eventual defeat. The battle was a turning point, one that provided the U.S. with the resources needed to carry out its final bombing campaigns and prepared the way for the invasion of Japan's home islands. Iwo Jima's strategic value, both in terms of its military function and its symbolic power, cemented its place as one of the most important victories of the Pacific War. The Battle of Iwo Jima remains one of the most iconic and poignant chapters in the history of both the United States and Japan. While it was a critical victory for the U.S. military, the battle also marked the end of Japan's territorial dominance in the Pacific. The aftermath of Iwo Jima has shaped the way both countries remember World War II, with each reflecting on the sacrifice, the suffering, and the heroism of those who fought on the island. For the United States, Iwo Jima has been memorialized as one of the great victories of World War II, a victory earned through extraordinary sacrifice. The iconic photograph of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of American courage, perseverance, and the cost of freedom. The U.S. Marines who fought on the island became synonymous with the ideal of duty and selflessness. The island and its memorials have become an indelible part of American military identity, reminding each generation of the price of war and the sacrifices made by those who served. In Japan, Iwo Jima is remembered through a different lens, one that reflects the tragic and heroic nature of the defense. While the island was lost, the bravery of the Japanese defenders, who fought to the death despite knowing that their cause was hopeless, continues to be honored. Japan reflects on the battle as a symbol of sacrifice, loyalty, and the unbreakable will of its soldiers. The aftermath of Iwo Jima serves as a reminder of the cost of war, not only in terms of military losses but also in terms of the human toll of unwavering loyalty to a cause that could not succeed. The lasting impact of the battle on American culture and military strategy. For American culture, Iwo Jima's impact has been profound and enduring. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of victory, but more importantly, it became a symbol of sacrifice. The U.S. military, particularly the Marine Corps, would carry this image forward as a reminder of the cost of victory. It became a touchstone for American military identity, inspiring generations of service members to reflect on the sacrifices made by those who came before them. The battle for Iwo Jima also had a significant impact on American military strategy. The experience of fighting on the island contributed to the development of amphibious warfare tactics, which would play a key role in future conflicts, such as the Korean War and the Vietnam War. The lessons learned from the brutal combat on Iwo Jima were integrated into military training and doctrine, particularly in terms of preparing for island assaults, fighting through fortified positions, and joint operations between air, sea, and ground forces. The Iwo Jima Memorial in Washington, D.C. has become one of the most recognizable symbols of American military sacrifice, a place where Americans gather each year to honor the memory of those who fought and died on the island. For the Marines, the battle remains the quintessential example of their core values: honor, courage, and commitment. How Japan reflects on its sacrifices, with memorials and national reflection on the war. In Japan, the memory of Iwo Jima is tinged with a sense of tragedy. The island, like many others in the Pacific, represents the futility of Japan's final defense against the inevitable American victory. The defenders of Iwo Jima, under the leadership of General Kuribayashi, fought with incredible bravery and determination, but their sacrifice ultimately could not change the course of the war. In the years following the battle, Japan began to reflect on the human cost of the war and the sacrifices made by both soldiers and civilians. Iwo Jima, and the defense of the island, has become a central theme in Japan's national reflection on World War II. Memorials and monuments have been erected to honor the Japanese soldiers who fought there, and these memorials often emphasize the sacrificial nature of their defense, the loyalty to their emperor, and the determination to protect their homeland. The Japanese people remember Iwo Jima as a sacrifice, not just by soldiers, but by an entire generation that gave everything in a conflict that ultimately brought about Japan's defeat and transformation. The Iwo Jima Memorial in Japan, located in Kadoribafuchi National Cemetery in Tokyo, stands as a quiet tribute to those who fought and died, offering a place for Japanese citizens to reflect on the cost of war. It's a reminder of the humanity on both sides of the battle and of the tragic nature of honor and loyalty in war. Lasting legacy: Iwo Jima is a permanent part of both nations' histories. The legacy of Iwo Jima is lasting and permanent, deeply embedded in the historical narratives of both the United States and Japan. The battle, though fought with overwhelming ferocity and loss, left a mark on both nations' histories that will never fade. For the U.S., it is a symbol of military resolve, the sacrifice of its service members, and the cost of victory. For Japan, it is a symbol of the price paid for honor, and a constant reminder of the war's devastating toll. The memorials, reflections, and stories passed down through generations will continue to honor the courage and sacrifice of those who fought on both sides of the battle. The Battle of Iwo Jima remains one of the most significant and defining moments in military history. The battle, fought in 1945, not only marked a crucial step toward Japan's eventual defeat in World War II but also left an enduring legacy that would shape military tactics, strategy, and the collective memory of both the United States and Japan. As the years passed, Iwo Jima's significance grew, not only as a military victory but as a symbol of sacrifice, courage, and honor. The legacy of Iwo Jima transcends its role in the Pacific War. Its impact can still be felt in modern military doctrine, where lessons from the island's brutal battle are applied to conflicts long after the war ended. The island's significance in air-ground operations, amphibious assaults, and coordinated fire support remains a cornerstone of military strategy. The battle is a turning point in the Pacific War and its role in shaping future tactics. Iwo Jima served as a turning point in the Pacific War, both strategically and symbolically. The battle marked the final phase of Japan's ability to resist American advances in the Pacific. With the capture of the island, the United States gained a key strategic position, allowing for the refueling of bombers and providing a launching point for future operations in the Japanese home islands. The battle was the pivotal precursor to the larger invasion of Okinawa and set the stage for the final push into Japan. From a military tactics perspective, the battle for Iwo Jima forced a reassessment of amphibious warfare. The Japanese defenses, especially the network of underground tunnels and bunkers, showed the necessity of adapting tactics for more fortified and entrenched positions. The battle also highlighted the importance of joint operations, with naval gunfire, air support, and ground assaults working together to overcome the island's defenses. The tactical lessons learned at Iwo Jima would go on to inform future military engagements, especially those involving island hopping in close-quarters combat in urban environments. The battle's sheer brutality also emphasized the importance of preparing soldiers mentally and physically for prolonged engagements, especially in environments where terrain and enemy fortifications were heavily integrated. The Marines, in particular, refined their combat training and coordination to face challenges like those encountered on Iwo Jima. The memorials, films, and ongoing reverence for the battle's heroes. The legacy of Iwo Jima has been preserved in a variety of memorials, films, and books, ensuring that future generations understand the significance of the battle. The Iwo Jima Memorial in Washington, D.C. remains a prominent symbol of the U.S. Marine Corps' valor and the sacrifices made during World War II. The image of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi continues to inspire pride and reverence for the men who fought there. The memorial stands as both a tribute and a reminder of the costs of war. Films like Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, directed by Clint Eastwood, helped bring the personal stories of the Marines and Japanese soldiers to the forefront, humanizing the battle and its significance. These films explored the emotional and psychological toll of the battle, showing not only the courage of the Marines but also the sacrifice of the Japanese soldiers who fought to the death. The battle's representation in media has ensured that the story of Iwo Jima is passed on to new generations, keeping its memory alive. In addition to film, literature and documentaries have contributed to the ongoing reflection on Iwo Jima's place in history. Books and oral histories from veterans offer a glimpse into the experiences of those who lived through the battle, ensuring that the personal sacrifices made during the battle are never forgotten. Memorial services continue to be held at the Iwo Jima Memorial and on the island itself, offering a space for veterans and families to reflect on the battle's impact. Enduring legacy, the battle's permanent place in the history of war. The legacy of Iwo Jima endures as a permanent part of the history of war. It is a testament to the sacrifice and courage displayed by those who fought there, a reminder of the cost of victory. Through memorials, films, and personal stories, the lessons learned at Iwo Jima continue to resonate in military strategy, culture, and national identity. Iwo Jima is not just a battle won, it is a legacy of sacrifice, one that continues to shape the U.S. military, the American public, and the history of the Pacific War. The Battle of Iwo Jima was a conflict defined by extreme sacrifice and unimaginable hardship. While history often speaks in grand terms of strategy and victory, it is the personal stories of those who fought, and the echoes of their voices, that truly capture the human cost of the battle. Survivors, veterans, and historians who have reflected on the battle continue to share their experiences, ensuring that the significance of Iwo Jima is passed down not just in the context of military achievement but in the lives of those who fought there. Veterans, when asked about the battle, often describe not just the fear and violence, but the human connection that sustained them through the darkest moments. Many Marines who survived the battle remember their comrades who didn't, and how those lost in the hellish combat of Iwo Jima continue to live in their memories. The faces of the fallen are as vivid in their minds as the battle itself. As one veteran recalled, "I don't remember much of the fighting, but I remember the faces of my friends as they went down." These personal reflections, shared by veterans and survivors, are integral to understanding the true cost of the battle. Iwo Jima was not just a place of military strategy and operation, it was a place where men became brothers, bound by the shared experience of combat, the terror of battle, and the need to fight for something larger than themselves. Veterans' stories about the human cost of the battle and their sense of duty. The stories of those who fought at Iwo Jima are often punctuated by moments of extreme courage, but also deep loss. Many of the veterans who survived were part of units that sustained heavy casualties, leaving them with a lifelong sense of guilt and survivor's remorse. The cost of Iwo Jima was not only measured by the death toll but also in the emotional burden carried by those who lived. Private First Class George J. Mudd recalled that the battle felt like an endless nightmare. There was no break, no time to breathe. Every time we took a step, someone fell. I remember thinking, why are we here? What are we fighting for? It didn't make sense, but you had no choice but to keep going. Mudd survived, but his brothers in arms did not. He later explained, "I came back, but I never really left Iwo Jima. The faces of my friends are still with me, and I think about them every day." Other veterans remember the bond that was forged in the intensity of the battle. Corporal Harlan Block, whose story would later become part of the flag-raising story, was known for his leadership and determination. When Block's unit was pinned down during the assault, he held the line and led his men to the summit of Mount Suribachi. He didn't survive the battle, but his courage has lived on in the hearts of those who knew him. Veterans like Franklin Sousley, another flag-raiser, are remembered not just for their heroism, but for the human connection they forged in the thick of battle. For many veterans, the sense of duty was not just to their country but to the men beside them. One Marine who fought on the island said, "It wasn't about doing it for the flag or the country. It was about the guy next to you. You couldn't leave him behind. We didn't have a choice." The brotherhood that emerged from the fighting at Iwo Jima has become an integral part of the Marine Corps ethos, shaping its identity for generations to come. How the battle shaped the identity of the Marines and American military ethos. The Battle of Iwo Jima became one of the defining moments for the U.S. Marine Corps, shaping the Marine identity for generations. The sacrifice and courage displayed in the face of unimaginable odds became a core part of what it meant to be a Marine. For many in the Corps, Iwo Jima would forever serve as a touchstone of honor, duty, and resolve, a symbol of the Marine Corps' unyielding commitment to completing the mission, no matter the cost. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi, an act of defiance and victory, became synonymous with the Marine Corps' spirit. For young Marines entering the Corps in the decades after the war, Iwo Jima was a living example of what was expected of them: to fight with honor, to endure unimaginable hardships, and to never give up. The symbolism of the flag raised atop Suribachi became the very essence of what it meant to serve in the Marine Corps, to be willing to give everything for country and comrades. The Marines' legacy from Iwo Jima would influence military thinking for years to come, particularly in terms of amphibious operations and joint warfare. The battle also cemented the Marines' reputation as elite fighters, able to accomplish difficult missions under extreme conditions. As one veteran said, Iwo Jima wasn't just a battle. It was a test of who we were as Marines. It made us who we are. Heartfelt remembrance, individual stories of survival and loss. The legacy of Iwo Jima is not just in the tactical victory or the strategic importance of the island, but in the individual stories of the men who fought there. Their personal sacrifices, their courage in the face of unrelenting opposition, and the bonds they formed with their comrades have become an integral part of the memory of Iwo Jima. These stories live on, passed down through veterans, families, and historians, ensuring that the human cost of the battle is never forgotten and that its lessons continue to shape the identity of the U.S. Marine Corps and American military history. The Battle of Iwo Jima was not just a physical test of endurance, but also a profound psychological challenge for the men who fought there. The intense combat, the loss of comrades, the unrelenting fear, and the traumatic violence left deep scars on the mental and emotional well-being of the Marines who survived. In many ways, Iwo Jima marked a turning point in how combat stress and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, would later be understood and acknowledged by the military and the broader public. For the Marines who fought at Iwo Jima, the psychological toll was immediate and intense. Many described the battle as relentless, where every day brought new horrors and where survival often seemed like a matter of pure luck. The constant bombardment, close-quarters combat, and the unyielding Japanese resistance pushed the Marines to their physical limits, but it was the mental strain that would prove to be the hardest battle to fight long after the war ended. How combat at Iwo Jima affected Marines' mental health and their return to civilian life. For many of the survivors of Iwo Jima, the emotional aftermath of the battle was as damaging as the physical wounds they bore. Combat fatigue, what would later be known as PTSD, was prevalent among the men who returned home after the battle. Nightmares, flashbacks, and a persistent sense of fear were common experiences for those who had faced the brutality of Iwo Jima. The sights and sounds of battle, including the constant explosions, the cries of the wounded, and the loss of comrades, became a permanent part of their memory. For the Marines who returned to civilian life, the adjustment was difficult. Many came home, not as the men who had left, but as individuals irrevocably changed by the violence they had witnessed. The camaraderie of the battlefield, the bonds forged in the heat of combat, were replaced with a sense of alienation. They struggled to reintegrate into a society that could never fully understand the trauma they had endured. The transition from war to home life was often jarring. Veterans found it difficult to explain their experiences to loved ones who had no frame of reference for the gruesome realities of battle. Many struggled in silence, unable to communicate the emotional toll the war had taken on them. As one veteran recalled, "We didn't talk about it. There was no one to talk to. We came home, but we didn't really come home." The psychological scars left by the battle and the long-term consequences of war. The psychological scars left by the battle were not just short-term effects of combat stress. For many, the wounds of Iwo Jima would last a lifetime. Veterans would often find themselves facing anxiety, depression, and survivor's guilt. The inability to escape the memories of their fallen comrades, the feeling of being haunted by what could have been done differently, and the constant battle to reconcile their war experiences with their civilian lives contributed to a deep and lasting sense of emotional pain. In some cases, the trauma of Iwo Jima was a silent affliction. Veterans would find ways to cope, but many carried the weight of their experiences without ever fully addressing them. The effects on their relationships, family lives, and careers were often profound. It took many years before the military and society at large began to recognize the psychological toll that Iwo Jima, and other battles of the war, had on the men who fought. The emotional burden of the battle often manifested in veterans' difficulty adjusting to life after the war. Many struggled with trust, finding it hard to connect with others on a deep level. They had seen their comrades die, had been pushed beyond human endurance, and often felt that they were isolated in their experiences. Some sought counseling, while others turned to substance abuse or self-destructive behavior as a way to escape the relentless memories. Somber reflection, the unseen cost of battle on the human psyche. The emotional and psychological toll of Iwo Jima was an unseen cost of the battle, one that would continue to affect the men who fought there long after the guns fell silent. Though the victory on the island was celebrated, the cost, both mental and emotional, remained with the survivors. Iwo Jima's true legacy is not only found in its strategic significance or symbolic importance, but also in the stories of survival, where the human psyche paid the price for victory, carrying the weight of war with the veterans for the rest of their lives. The Battle of Iwo Jima had a profound emotional impact not just on the Marines and soldiers who fought, but on the American public as a whole. The staggering casualty figures, over 6,800 American Marines killed and thousands more wounded, rippled through the country. As the nation learned of the heavy losses in the Pacific, a sense of grief and collective mourning took hold. The sacrifice of Iwo Jima was felt in the very heart of the American home front, where families, communities, and the nation as a whole grappled with the brutal toll of war. The American public had already witnessed the horrors of World War II, but the battle for Iwo Jima brought the reality of the war even closer. The iconic flag raising on Mount Suribachi, while a symbol of victory, could not erase the deep emotional scars caused by the loss of so many young lives. Families across the country mourned their sons, brothers, and fathers, who had been part of the Marine assault that claimed the island. The news that came home about the battle was often delivered in the form of official letters or telegrams, informing families that their loved ones had been killed in action. The war was no longer just a faraway conflict, it had come home in a deeply personal and painful way. The war bond drives, memorial services, and the role of Iwo Jima in bolstering national unity. Despite the immense grief, the American public was resolute. The victory at Iwo Jima, while incredibly costly, became a rallying point for national unity. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi, captured in the now famous photograph, was reproduced in newspapers and posters, symbolizing the determination and spirit of the American fighting forces. In the aftermath of the battle, the war bond drives gained even more momentum, as the American people sought to contribute financially to the war effort and honor the sacrifices of their soldiers. The memorial services held across the United States further solidified the nation's shared sense of loss and pride. The flag-raising ceremony itself became a national symbol, not just of victory, but of the sacrifice that victory had required. In communities across the country, citizens gathered in church services and public memorials to mourn the loss of those who had given their lives for the war effort. Even as the war raged on, the American spirit was fortified by the knowledge that Iwo Jima represented the tremendous resilience and sacrifice of the nation's soldiers. Many saw the American victory at Iwo Jima as a necessary step toward the ultimate defeat of Japan, but the nation also recognized the high cost of such progress. Despite the pride in the victory, there was a sense of sorrow that permeated the home front, a collective recognition that, while the war effort was achieving its goals, the price was steep. The emotional weight of sending so many men to fight and die on the island. For the American public, the emotional burden of sending so many men to fight and die on Iwo Jima was felt most acutely by the families of the fallen. The Marines who went ashore at Iwo Jima were not just soldiers, they were sons and brothers, fathers and husbands. For many families, the loss of a loved one during the battle was not just a personal tragedy, it was a shared national grief. The casualty lists published by newspapers became a regular reminder of the human cost of war. The names of the fallen were read aloud in communities, and families were left to cope with the unimaginable pain of losing someone in the prime of life. The grief experienced by the families of Iwo Jima's casualties became a collective mourning that united the country, transcending regional, social, and cultural boundaries. But despite the devastating losses, the families of the fallen also found pride in their sacrifice. Many families came to view their loved ones' deaths not as senseless, but as part of a greater cause, the defeat of tyranny, the preservation of freedom, and the victory of democracy. The flag raising on Mount Suribachi, while a symbol of victory, also served as a reminder of the immense sacrifices that had made that victory possible. Collective mourning, the sacrifice of the nation reflected in grief. The battle for Iwo Jima left an indelible mark on the American consciousness, one that would be felt for generations. The victory achieved on that island, though celebrated, was a bittersweet triumph. The grief and sacrifice felt by the families of the fallen Marines was shared by the entire nation. Iwo Jima, though small in size, became a symbol of the ultimate price of war, the loss of life, the cost of freedom, and the sacrifice of those who gave everything for the future of their country. The collective mourning of Iwo Jima was not just about the loss of American soldiers, but about the sacrifice of a nation at war. The victory at Iwo Jima would forever be intertwined with the memory of those who gave their lives to achieve it, and the shared grief of the American public ensured that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. The ocean surrounding Iwo Jima serves as a final resting place for the countless American and Japanese soldiers who fought and died on its rugged shores. Beneath the waters, the wreckage of ships, planes, and the remains of the fallen are preserved, offering a silent tribute to the sacrifice and bravery that defined the battle. The island itself is now a hallowed memorial, but it is the sea that holds the ghosts of war, where the wrecks of the battle remain submerged, a reminder that war's aftermath is not just marked by the physical remnants of battle, but also by the stillness of the deep. The waters surrounding Iwo Jima are more than just a geographic location. They are an ocean that remembers. The wreckage of American planes, Japanese warships, and sunk vessels are scattered across the seafloor, their once shining surfaces now covered with coral and marine life. These sunken remains serve as both memorial and marker, reminding future generations of the immense cost of the battle that unfolded on the island. The sea does not forget, it cradles the lost, offering them an eternal resting place where their sacrifice is silently honored. The wreckage of the battle, now lying beneath the waves, preserved as a tribute to the fallen. The wreckage of Iwo Jima's battle is preserved beneath the waves, where it remains largely untouched by time and the ravages of war. For decades, historians and divers have sought to explore the ocean floor, discovering the remnants of Japanese bunkers, scattered wreckage, and sunk ships. These sunken memorials act as a reminder of the devastating conflict that once raged above them. For the survivors and descendants of those who fought at Iwo Jima, these submerged wrecks serve as final resting places for the men they loved and lost. They carry the weight of personal stories, the stories of the Marines who gave their lives to capture the island, and the Japanese soldiers who fought to the death in defense of their homeland. Diverse and historical researchers visit these wrecks, paying homage to the men who remain beneath the waves, ensuring that their sacrifice is not forgotten. The ocean is a silent witness to the human cost of the battle, holding the secrets of those who died, the wreckage of planes and ships marking the spot where bravery, tragedy, and honor intersect. These remains stand as enduring monuments to the soldiers who gave everything they had for their country and their cause, preserved forever in the stillness of the sea. How Iwo Jima's wrecks and grave sites continue to be honored by descendants, historians, and veterans. The legacy of Iwo Jima lives on not just in the form of memorials on land but also through the remembrance of its wrecks and grave sites. Over the years, veterans, descendants, and historians have made it a point to visit the island, the sea, and the various memorials to honor the lives lost. The wreckage, often viewed from beneath the surface, is a silent memorial to those who died on the battlefield. For the descendants of both American and Japanese soldiers, the search for their ancestors' remains becomes a deeply emotional journey. Families of the fallen Marines visit the memorials and the shores of Iwo Jima, their eyes scanning the horizon for a connection to their past. Meanwhile, the descendants of the Japanese defenders honor their ancestors at the Japanese memorials, reflecting on the sacrifice made by their loved ones. Ceremonies and tributes continue to be held in honor of the fallen on both sides of the battle, ensuring that their memory remains alive and respected. The wrecks and grave sites beneath the waves also serve as a historical reference point for those studying the tactics, human cost, and legacy of the battle. These sites offer scholars and researchers a window into the past, where they can study the remains of the battle, learn from the remnants of the war, and continue to pass on the lessons of Iwo Jima to future generations. The wrecks are not just physical remnants of the past, they are an ongoing part of the story of World War II and the cost of victory in war. Poignant stillness, the island is a silent witness to the passage of time. The ocean around Iwo Jima is more than just a body of water, it is a silent witness to the sacrifice made by thousands of men. The wreckage, now lying beneath the waves, serves as a poignant tribute to the bravery of those who fought and died on the island. The sea holds their memory, its depths silently preserving the stories of sacrifice, heroism, and loss. Iwo Jima, both as an island and as a part of the ocean's vast expanse, remains a permanent and silent monument to the human cost of war.